what I was asked today, I think our organization is presenting about once a month, just providing data to the council on various issues or events in the Utah, Salt Lake City, Salt Lake County economies. And I was asked just to touch a bit on a opportunity index that we developed about 3 or 4 years ago. We have updated it. It's the first map on the handout, and this was developed in combination with HUD, and HUD had developed they 4 or 5 years ago, they got very interested in access to opportunity, and access to opportunity at the local level, the neighborhood level. And what does that mean? Access to opportunity can be schools, it can be healthcare, it can be food deserts, and so on. What we did is combine 4 variables with 5 from HUD to develop an index, and then we came up with a composite score for each census tract and scored those census tracts based on very low opportunity to high opportunity, 1 to 10, and at 5 different levels of opportunity. And you can see from the map that what we have is the low opportunity is basically west of State Street, maybe 5th East. The high opportunity is generally east of 9th East, but there's a pocket over by the university, and then out on the southeast corner of the city. And we have just produced 2018 numbers for census tracts and renters by census tract, as well as owner-occupied units. We are not using the census data for that small area where you're talking about a census tract. The census data have huge margins of error, and the data really aren't reliable. What we have done is looked at the building permit activity at a very detailed micro level and assigned the types of units, and then assumed some vacancy rates and occupancy and who's renting and so on to come up with the renters. Now, the reason focusing on renters, they are the most vulnerable population. In my view, we hear a lot about a housing crisis. The housing crisis is really those folks who are under the median income and primarily renters. They are the ones who face oftentimes a housing crisis. And so what I've done in Table 1 is provide the number of renters in each of the opportunity levels. And you can see that about 75% are moderate income or below, and 40% are low or very low renter households. It's interesting, about 25% are high, and that's around the university, East Side, Sugar House, and that kind of surprised me, that number, that there were that many renters in high opportunity areas. But this doesn't tell us, this map and this table it does not tell us anything about the income of those renters. And we don't have that kind of detailed data. But if you flip over or go to the maps on the back side, we can infer a little bit about income based on where the Section 8 voucher holders, where they are located, as well as where the rent-assisted projects are located. Now, the Section 8 voucher program, in order to qualify, you have to have an income below 50% area median income. So over in Table 4, that shows you what the upper limit would be. Now, for a family of 4, the upper limit would be $24,000, almost $25,000. So a family of 4 under $25,000 would be considered extremely low income household, and that household is not just at 50%, they are at 30% of the area median income. So, okay, thanks. Yeah, that's Table 4 here, split there. These, again, they are extremely low income, 30% AMI. This is the group that is most vulnerable and also most in need and the most difficult to reach. And also, when I say most vulnerable, that is the most vulnerable to homelessness. They are at the whim of the landlord and the market, and also subject to any sort of an event, whether it's medical, domestic violence, auto accident, where they might end up having to find housing elsewhere, friend, family, and unfortunately in some cases, the shelter. So, as you can see from those two maps, and again, if we want to say something about income, both the vouchers and the affordable projects, the rent-assisted projects, are 90% of those are located in moderate to very low income census tracts. And even though there are rental units, and we've looked, there's 25% of the rental units are in the high opportunity areas, the very low income, for lots of reasons, primarily though rental rates, cannot afford to live in a high opportunity area. Even the voucher holders, and this is an issue nationally, and they've done some studies on, voucher holders tend to stay in low income areas, low opportunity areas. Even though they do have a voucher, if they could find a unit, an apartment project that would accept a voucher, they could move to a higher opportunity area. But for some reasons, they tend to stay, those households tend to stay in low opportunity areas. Seattle, I think it is, has actually had a program where they provide counseling service and a service to the voucher holders to let them know where else they could possibly live that has higher opportunity for their children. And I know the council and I know the state is struggling with the issue of, we got money, but we don't have takers, or you want to locate projects in high opportunity areas and try to incentivize that, and you don't have a lot of takers, and that comes down to some market forces that prevent that. Just a editorial comment. Over the years that I've worked on affordable housing, we've had a lot of discussion, and we've had efforts to build, and we have done some. We will never build ourselves out of this problem. It's just too large. And it's great that we have programs, whether it's tax credit or other programs, some of the programs that HUD provides. But we have often talked on the side of, we got to get more units. That's the supply side. Over on the other side, you have the demand side, which is really income. It comes down to income. Income is just as important a part of this equation as the supply of units. And any way we can help renters, particularly with maybe not direct, but indirect, like vouchers and so on, whether it's temporary assistance for renters who are about to be evicted. That's a form of income. There are a number of programs on the income side, but it's really been it hasn't been emphasized like the supply side. I'll just go to a couple of programs now that are under discussion. And as I said, this is really the first time for a lot of years that we've had the legislature involved. And last year, the Housing Commission, the commission was set up by the legislature, the Commission on Housing Affordability. And they tried to get something passed, but it got caught up in the tax reform. And they're taking another run at it now. What they're looking at really after considering RDAs and their role in affordable housing, TODs and their role in affordable housing, some zoning issues, they've settled on really tax credit, so that's units, stimulating the tax credit market, and then on the other side, state vouchers. And we're talking in the neighborhood of $30 million in ongoing funding. Hopefully they will get, and that will provide some voucher assistance to probably, they're talking about $10 million on state vouchers, which would be spread throughout the state. But certainly the Salt Lake City Housing Authority would, that hasn't really been decided, but I'm sure it'll be the housing authorities who administer those state vouchers. The housing authorities now do the federal vouchers, and it'll come through the umbrella of the Olin Walker Housing Loan Fund. And $10 million a year would help about 1,500 families ongoing. And it's really a lifeline if they go to those who are most in need, and that, in my view, is under 30% AMI. So that's a program that's underway. The mock-up for the draft bill is underway, and it goes to leadership, I think, in the next 30 days. Our office is involved in a number of studies. Just want to let you know about those studies. And one is on best practices by Utah cities and counties to address the issue of affordable housing. And we're looking at 4 or 5 ADUs would be one. Some zoning issues would be another. TODs is another, probably RDAs is another. The role those programs have played in providing affordable housing, and what's the best way, best policies within those programs where we see outcomes, positive outcomes. Then we are also in the process of getting funding for and it's pretty much certain on the TODs. This is through UTA. What we're looking at is the impact of TODs on housing supply. And we would do that across the whole system, so the 4 Wasatch Front counties, the commuter rail system as well as the light rail. And then of particular interest, I think, for Salt Lake City, there are what we call stretch TODs. That would be 4 South, and then North Temple, where you have several stations and a lot of development. And we want to find out what the contribution in housing, survey some of the residents nearby to find out how their modes of transportation might have changed since they arrived in the TOD. And that'll be about a year-long study. And then we are doing a study that will look at the impact of high-density residential development on surrounding real estate values. That's always an issue when a developer, or an issue that the planning commissions must face, is residents are worried about this new apartment project that, even though it's a great tax credit project or it's a market rate project, it's high density and it's going to impact my property values. And we're going to do case studies of 8 to 10 cities where there's high growth across the Wasatch Front to see if, in fact, what the data show, and if property values are negatively affected, or in some cases positively affected. So anyway, we just, the Gardner Policy Institute, certainly we want to make data available, and our discussions on a monthly basis, and help in any way we can with the number of issues, and I'm particularly interested in housing, and be glad to enter into a discussion, talk, questions and answers.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Wood. Councilmember Valdemoros.
Thank you, Mr. Wood. This is great. With these studies that you're going to be doing, in looking at the maps, there's a high concentration of low-income housing in certain areas of the city. Are you going to study at all if there are concentrations of a certain type of housing in parts of the city that might be unfair or might be going against HUD regulations about concentrations of the same type of housing in certain parts of the city? Because I remember reading a study about low-income units or residential units located in one part of the city that might be unfair.
Yeah. In the work that we did for HUD 2 or 3 years ago, it's the issue of housing availability and price has led, and we didn't use this word because it's a bit loaded, but if you look at the maps of ethnicity and race, and we did map all the 4 Wasatch Front counties, you found that there was high concentrations of minority and ethnic groups. It was basically a corridor that ran in Salt Lake County that ran from the north boundary of Salt Lake City, west of I-15, along that corridor. Then it turned west at South Salt Lake, so a little bit east in South Salt Lake. Then it went west to West Valley, and there were a park and a little bit in Taylorsville. We looked at that segregation, and that was the word we did not use, in 2000 and 2010. And you could see, and a lot of it has to do with housing and zoning ordinances, you could see growing concentrations in that corridor and not much difference in the rest of the county. And that is an issue it's a huge educational issue for the schools because you have English as a second language, you have districts or schools that are transitory. There's a lot of moving in and out. And so it becomes a real issue for the school district and the schools. And it's, again, it's heavily loaded in the low opportunity areas where not only the kids, but family members and parents. What we found when we started mapping it was, for example, the UTA line would have, they weren't as sensitive, in my view, in those days to, they were more interested in getting people out of their cars into tracks rather than putting lines where there were transit-dependent people. And you can see that if we run a line out to Draper, and it's not heavily used, whereas you go west of about 2700 west, and you have bus rapid transit now, but it would have been great if they'd have run that line west and over to Taylorsville. But yeah, that's zoning and prices are really a reflection of zoning ordinances, and over time, you know, we have, it is what it is. We have high pockets of low-income households in low-opportunity areas. Yeah.
Councilmember Johnston.
Thank you very much for all this. One point of clarification, I think you're right about everything except for the 30 million is 10 million is ongoing. No one's listening to me anyway, so it doesn't matter. I can say whatever I want.
I know you're on the commission, right?
Yeah, so the 30 million, 10 million is ongoing for the vouchers, the state bill that's being crafted right now. The rest of it's one time this year that would go into Olin Walker for various reasons. So one of the pressures that you mentioned, we can't build our way out of this as far as build enough units to just have the market correct it, because the market doesn't create affordability. One of the pressures that is happening, though, is even with vouchers. Generally, vouchers are only able to be used if you find a unit that is within a window of price, right? If the market prices everything above that window, even incrementally, because HUD will only raise that window like $25 a year or something. I mean, it's something very small. If the market keeps as hot as it is and the windows all go up, even the vouchers don't help. So the subsidy we have could be less and less useful if we don't have the market stabilize at some point where there are enough units in that window that you can use the subsidy for. So it's a big issue that we haven't talked a lot about because it's hard to sort of wrap our heads around this, I think. But a hot market is wonderful, but it even undermines our subsidies in some ways if they can't be tracked or scaled to the more the market is right now.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that gap, fair market rent is what it's called, is that cap. And in Salt Lake County, and that would apply to Salt Lake City, a two-bedroom with utilities is about $1,035. So utilities will probably be off of that, probably maybe the $135. So for the two-bedroom, it's $900. And of course, nothing that's being built now in Salt Lake City. All the activities downtown or Sugar House. I've done some work on the downtown area. The downtown area, the average price of the 18 new projects that have been built since 2012, a one-bedroom is $1,600, a two-bedroom is $1,800, and a three-bedroom's $2,000, and a studio is about $1,100. So but that's just a fraction of the market. There are a lot of over on the avenues. There must have been a zoning ordinance that you couldn't build over 25 or more than 24 units because there are all sorts of 24-unit older projects that I'm sure there's some voucher holders in those projects, but not a lot. I think most of them are probably on west of I-15, unfortunately. But that is a problem. Cities, in fact, Provo's engaged in this right now in a survey to show HUD that, in fact, the fair market rent is higher than what the regs show. But that is a really laborious process. I was involved in that once, and doing the survey work to satisfy HUD is just a huge impediment. It's really hard for cities to do that.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I appreciate all the data from the Institute, Mr. Wood. I appreciate it very much. The only thing I'd bring up also is he mentioned Seattle and a pilot program they're doing about how do you move folks with the vouchers to other parts of the city they could live in. As a navigator, essentially. You hire staff who can help them navigate and know there's units here, there's rentals there, else in the city. Here's where schools are, here's where markets are. Here's where you sort of get used to a new area of the city. It's not that we purposely exclude anybody, but if you're not used to another area of the city, you're not going to move there. And so in order to sort of diversify the city, we may have to look at that as a program for the city itself to help folks navigate different neighborhoods and feel more comfortable there.
Yeah.
Councilmember Rogers.
Mr. Wood, I guess my question is, I've seen a couple versions of the Opportunity Index, and Salt Lake City has made some big investment. If you look at our transportation, where we're funding, through UTA bus routes that are west-east connectors. For me in the future, I know that you guys are collecting data, but I would love to see how the Opportunity Index is changing over time through the investments that Salt Lake City is making, whether it's, the housing programs that we're funding, or it's the street infrastructure that we're doing, or, it's what we're doing in creating that opportunity to the workforce or to education or that type of thing.
Yeah. Well, part of that's HUD dependent because they provide us with a fair amount of the data. Some of this we have developed on 4 of the variables, but we will be doing some updates. We haven't yet. We have done a set of maps for each county for the Utah Housing Corporation, which oversees the tax credit program. They give bonus points for projects that are located in moderate to high opportunity areas. So those maps were done a couple of years ago. I would expect that they'll come back to us and say, it's time to update those. We could work, maybe we ought to work with the city and develop some opportunity and refine the process. There are some refinements I think that we could do, one on transportation. So that was something that we are certainly open to.
Well, Mr. Chair, I know that the City Council currently has a contract with, I just blew a mind blank, the Kim Gardner Policy Institute. So I would love to look at that and seeing what the things that the council is doing to create opportunities to address these issues.
Agreed. Councilmember Fowler.
I just wanted to say thanks. Thank you for taking time to be here and for bringing this information. I think these conversations, and thank you to the chair for making this a priority on our agendas, because I think we're all feeling the effects of the housing crisis and what's happening. And I think having these conversations create ideas like, oh, this voucher program, that sounds like a great idea. That Andrew's absolutely right. I live in Sugar House, and I love living in Sugar House, and I'm not going to move to a different neighborhood because I have all of my things in my neighborhood, right? And similarly, why would I expect somebody else to just pick up and move from wherever they know without understanding another part of the city, or refining and redefining some of our opportunity zones so that we can create sound policies? Working with the Kim Gardner Institute to do that, those are the conversations that we need to be having so that we can really look at what's happening housing-wise in our city in a comprehensive and holistic manner.
Yeah.
So thank you for being here and providing this information and taking time to kind of advise us on these things.
Well, thank you, and we would love to get more involved, and if it's on the one area of the Opportunity Index, that would be terrific. As you said, it affects all of us, and I feel the effects. I have a granddaughter and 2 great-grandchildren living with me, so I am a me and my wife are a multi-generational household. And unlike, I think, the other cycles I've followed, going back to the 70s, the difference in this cycle is the difficulty of young households to even qualify for the rental market. It's really tough. So, and I feel that. Anyway, so thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Wood, I have one more question for you, but it's more of a request to come back.
Okay.
At a future meeting. But one of the things that you mentioned was zoning, and how zoning tends to get in the way of housing affordability and housing options. And so one of the things that I think the council would be interested in hearing is, what different ideas are for zoning changes, where in the zoning code are we getting hung up right now? So I don't expect you to answer that today, but that's something I think in the future that would be helpful for us to hear.
Well, we have been approached, and I didn't talk to the person from the city. Someone talked to to Jenny Robinson, our operating officer, about evaluating housing programs that the city has undertaken. And I'm going to be working with Lanny on best use, some of the, or not best use, best practices, and look at what, I think the city has been a leader, and we want to look at what the city's done and the outcomes have been, and look forward to a growing relationship with the city on housing.
Great.
So, thank you.
Mr. Wood. We really appreciate it. It is now 5 after 3. We have made a couple of adjustments on our agenda. So if you have an agenda in front of you, we will not be discussing the Livable Streets Program proposal today, nor will we be discussing the budget amendment number 2. Those will be rescheduled for a future meeting. So we are going to jump right into our fact-finding discussion relating to homelessness. I know that we do have some seating here, but there is also seating across the hall. If anybody's in the hall and would be more comfortable sitting there, that's an option. We also have a video recording of comments. So if you would like to share a comment with us out in the hall, you can record your comments, and that way you don't need to wait for the formal meeting tonight when we have the public comments, and you can also speak longer than 2 minutes if you do that. So that is an option for you as well.
In the hallway by the bell.
Yeah, so if you're interested in doing that, you just walk out these doors, and then it's just down the hall by the balcony there. So one of the reasons, so we as a council, we've been talking a lot about homelessness for years. And we thank you all for joining us today. And there's some information that we wanted to get out through our speakers, which is why we've scheduled this today. So because of the complexity of the homeless situation, there are so many different moving pieces related to the shelter, related to the opening of the new resource centers. There has been quite a bit of discussion with the recent cold snap a couple weeks ago about space in the emergency winter shelter. And the council released a statement sharing similar concerns with what we've heard from the community about the timing and the availability of the winter shelter. The state owns the land that the road home is on, where that shelter would end up going, and so the state decides the timeline of that shelter. But we also know that there are concerns about what happens if the closure date comes and we don't have workable solutions in place. So to get a better understanding of how we can all work together to keep people sheltered this winter, we're hosting a fact-finding meeting today so that we can talk about some of these things. On our agenda, we will be hearing from the ACLU. We'll be hearing from the Salt Lake Valley Coalition to End Homelessness, Mayor Biskupski's administration. We will also hear from Salt Lake County Mayor Wilson's administration, and Jonathan Hardy, who's the director of Housing and Community Development Division with the Department of Workforce Services. So those are some of the groups that we're going to be hearing from today. We do want to emphasize that this is a statewide problem. It is an issue that is not just related to Salt Lake City. However, as the capital city, we have the majority of the issues that we're facing. So we appreciate the state's involvement. At least they're acknowledging that there is an issue and that this is a statewide issue, and that is something that we've been trying as a city to get them to acknowledge for a long time. We ask other cities throughout the state to join us in this effort. This is not something that if someone is struggling with housing, if someone is struggling with homelessness, it is unfair to that individual to simply ship them to Salt Lake City. People need to stay in their communities, in their cities, in their neighborhoods. That's what we would like to see as we move forward. Homelessness is extremely disruptive to those experiencing it. And adding another point of a transition or movement to those individuals is not fair. And it is something that, as a city, we, are handling a lot of this, but we do need help from the rest of the state and other municipalities and counties around the state. So let's jump right in with the ACLU. Jason Groth is here from the ACLU. And the topic that we've asked Mr. Groth to talk about is the general rights of people experiencing homelessness. We have about 10 minutes allotted for your presentation and then 20 minutes for questions. And Mr. Groth, are you going to be, will somebody be joining you or just you? Okay. So two members of our council have been asked to be excused. They're out of town, so Councilmember Wharton and Councilmember Mendenhall.
Okay, so I have a PowerPoint. We're going to try to get that sorted, but thank you for having the ACLU here today to speak to these issues. And I think there is a PowerPoint handout in front of everybody, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, great. So I'm going to grab my laptop and follow along with mine until we get this sorted.
While we're waiting, we can talk about the fact that you're a former public defender, which I appreciate, and you're a self-proclaimed hipster. So I just want everybody in the audience to know that.
Yeah, so if you want to grab some avocado toast later, I'd be happy to do that. But yeah, so kind of jumping into it while we get the tech sorted. Former public defender out of Colorado. I'm an attorney at the ACLU right now, working the Smart Justice programming. So we work on criminal justice reform across the state. So I'm really going to be looking at, that's kind of my lane or wheelhouse as we have this discussion today. So the first thing I just want to address, and maybe it seems really obvious to a lot of people, but I think this isn't brought to the forefront in policy discussions, is that when we look at rights of unsheltered people or people experiencing homelessness or have insecure housing, those rights are the same for everybody from our Utah Constitution and U.S. Constitution. It doesn't matter what your housing status is. And again, it may seem odd that I'm bringing this up, but I think the reality of a lot of what we look at when you look at policy decisions made around people experiencing homelessness is that that's not brought to the forefront, that we don't understand, we don't consider the impact of those individuals' rights and what that can look like. We don't consider the impact of criminal laws and enforcement on that community. And we also, one of the things that I've noticed in our work generally around these issues is we don't consult the main stakeholders when it comes to these issues, and that's the impacted community. That is the people experiencing homelessness. And I think that's a huge miss. And I know that organizationally, with our organization, it's something we're really trying to do better by. And I think it's one of those things that historically, a lot of organizations haven't done that, but we need to do a better job of looking at how impacted communities think about these issues before we actually enact policy decisions. So one of the things that we did recently Okay, it's still flickering. Okay. Is that we wrote a report on Operation Rio Grande, the sequel, so Operation Rio Grande Endgame. One of the things that we propose in there is what's called the Homeless Bill of Rights. And it's a way to surface the idea that individuals experiencing homelessness have the same rights as you or I do, or somebody with secure housing. And so this is an example. This can be tailored to different communities, municipalities, how they want to enact a Bill of Rights. But it's a good guidepost and reminder of the rights that people experiencing homelessness do have. Some of these things also we may just miss whenever we do these policy considerations. So for example, some of this includes protection from harassment or intimidation in public and private spaces, also notification of service changes that are huge, that really impact that community, to give a heads up when things are going to change. And we think that the Homeless Bill of Rights could be something that could be adopted organizationally by a city council themselves, or a municipality or a county. I know some state legislatures have floated this idea by as well. But it's a great way to have a guidepost when we have these conversations, these deep dive policy considerations. We don't miss the mark when it comes to a lot of issue areas that may not be at the forefront, but are definitely going to come up as policies get enacted. And so, one of the things we can look at are the lessons from Operation Rio Grande, and thinking about law enforcement heavy phase 1 approach that resulted in mass arrests. In the first year, we have over 5,000 arrests. And if you actually look at the numbers behind that, low-level offenses make up the majority of those arrests. That's misdemeanors and infractions. And those low-level crimes often impact people without housing more than others. And that is because just some of those daily activities that you do in the privacy of your own home, you don't really have a choice not to do those in public spaces at times. And I'll talk about some of those specific laws through Salt Lake City itself in a little bit. But if you actually look at the arrest numbers, in a 35-day snapshot from the first year of Rio Grande, the first month, we have a little bit over 1,200 arrests. 64% of those arrests are for misdemeanors and infractions. And of those low-level offense arrests, we have 26% are B and C infractions. Jump ahead a year later, snapshot from the same time frame. The number of arrests are down, but the percentages are about the same. It's actually a little bit more that you have almost 70% of arrests are for those misdemeanors and infractions. And then the percent of arrests for low-level misdemeanors and infractions, B and Cs, is 34%. So when we think about that impact, and the idea of Operation Rio Grande is going to be a filter to connect people to resources, there's a big miss here when we look at our city justice court. So those B and C misdemeanors, those go to the city justice court. That's the court that handles those plus infractions. Unfortunately, the funding to get into diversion programs, to get into housing, to substance abuse treatment, mental health treatment, wasn't there at the justice court level. It was at the county level for your Class A misdemeanors and your felonies. And so unfortunately, that filter system didn't work for low-level offenses. It actually disrupted access to services, and then those arrests and convictions actually create hurdles and barriers to get access to help. So an example of this is that if you're waiting to get housing and you're on a list and you have a warrant that pops up, you get kicked to the back of that list for housing, and it doesn't matter what the warrant is for. It could be for something like jaywalking, and so that's actually going to disrupt you from getting housing services. And so just kind of looking at the collateral consequences for mass arrests, we see there's a lot of issues for like the intent and the infrastructure that was available and the actual outcomes. And just generally, if you look at these kind of mass arrest sweeps, you can see that the criminal justice system isn't the best or even a good or proper filter for social services and medical services. And again, like I said, they create these roadblocks rather than off-ramps into services. And so if we look at, let's see. We have it? Okay, that's great timing because I have some infographics I'd like to show that I think would be very tedious and boring if I try to talk about them aloud. Great, thank you. So let me get aligned here. So this is great timing. So when we look at other cities, so the ACLU of Minnesota looked at Minneapolis and they did an impact review of the top 10 crimes for people experiencing homelessness. And this is what they came up with. And you'll see a lot of this stuff are similar to statutes or the code that we have for Salt Lake City. So consuming alcohol in public, open bottles, warrants, trespassing, loitering with intent to have a narcotics offense, theft crimes, disorderly conduct, begging, panhandling, drug paraphernalia, and public urination. So those are the top 10 crimes for people experiencing homelessness, or top 10 low-level offense arrests. Not everything is exactly the same, but when we think about next steps, we have the data. We can see how many arrests there were, the type of offenses there were, but if we really break it down and can actually access who's being impacted, especially our people or population experiencing homelessness, it could be very useful to see how we're actually using law enforcement resources and to what end. And so one thing that they also did in Minneapolis is that it looked at how many times you're actually getting arrested for low-level offenses from, if you're a person experiencing homelessness. And then the officers individually how many arrests they were making of people for low-level offenses. And you could see some interesting stuff come out of the fallout out of their data over this time period from 2012 to 14. One officer made over 2,000 arrests for these low-level offenses. And so it gives us a better idea of how we can think about law enforcement as resources on these issues and what we're actually doing as far as allocating time and money and bodies to these issues. And this actually looks at the with that impact review, we're actually looking at the number of people that are arrested and how many times they get arrested. And so we could look at, from this infographic, right, that we have 474 homeless people were arrested for low-level offenses 5 or more times between these dates. And so these are people that are getting picked up, put into the criminal justice system, cycling out and cycling back in over and over and over again. So it helps us really, if we could do more of a deep dive analysis of what has happened with our arrest data, we can really see what is working, what's not working, and what just seems to be penalizing people because they are experiencing homelessness. And so some of the recommendations that came out of this Minneapolis impact review were to create a task force to review the criminal codes and see where we can decriminalize some of these offenses that don't merit that stigmatization, collateral consequences, and public resources that go into enforcing those sort of crimes. We also should look at not rewarding just by the numbers, arrests and stops for law enforcement. And then also, and I think we're actually starting to do this now, is expanding our diversion programs, looking at alternatives to the criminal justice system. And so I went through our Salt Lake City code. This isn't exhaustive, but I put together a list of offenses that may disproportionately impact unsheltered people. This is just Salt Lake City. This isn't the state or county ordinances. And so I underlined some that are pretty common. You might see some camping ordinances. There's some on the next page that include things that I'm a runner. I go for runs around Liberty Park a bunch of times, but you can actually be cited for spitting in a public space. That's enforceable. And so in that running community, that's something that I don't see a lot of interaction with law enforcement, right? Not going after the running spitters, right? But people experiencing homelessness may be subject to these laws in a way that a lot of us otherwise are not. So it could be a really useful thing to just have a committee look through these laws, see what the purpose of them are for, whether or not they should exist as enforcement mechanisms, and maybe start clearing out some of these issues that may not be an issue or may just disproportionately impact some populations. And I think part of that too should be with a lens of a changing legal landscape around people experiencing homelessness. And so there's a bunch of these cases kicking around. Most recently out of the Ninth Circuit in Boise, Idaho, there came a ruling that essentially says that laws criminalizing people that are sleeping outside when there's no shelter space available violates your Eighth Amendment rights against cruel and unusual punishment. And the thought process, the rationale behind that is that choice to be outside in public space is illusory. If you have no place to go, you shouldn't be criminalized for something you have no control over. And also we can look at other rulings and other litigation that looks at equal protection issues where people may be enforced at a high level, a certain group of people enforced at a high level for no camping ordinances compared to other groups. Or for example, the spitting ordinance, right? And so part of that is just seeing looking at the data, seeing how things are being enforced. If there's targeted enforcement for a specific population, you can see there's an equal protection issue and think, this is maybe something we should be addressing through legislation or modifying some of our city codes. And I guess just kind of wrap this up, and I understand these are big picture issues, and we could dive into this for quite some time, especially in the legal end, but perspective shift. Think about if law enforcement is outside your house or apartment most of the time, just waiting and watching to see what's going to happen. And especially if there's strict enforcement. And so maybe just my experience driving around here, but I think if they wanted to get a bunch of people for not using their turn signal, that's probably a ripe area to start getting people in the criminal justice system. And so just think about like how that also feels as a person to be in your community, being watched by law enforcement all the time, regardless of the intention, right? Do you act differently? Do you feel differently? That's from the reality for a lot of these people experiencing homelessness when we think about law enforcement as a solution to these issues. And also imagine that policymakers decide the criminal justice system is going to help you access doctors and healthcare, right? And that's kind of how we think about the criminal justice system when it comes to people experiencing homelessness. So this is a way to help you, but if that is the way to get you help, there feels like a huge disconnect, and a lot of that just has to do with dignity of being a person in the community and respecting that. So with that, I'll kind of wrap it up there. Definitely looking forward to the question section, but if you have more questions or if you want to download the report, you can check out this information here on our websites.
Great. Thank you for your comments and for your work on this. Councilmember Fowler.
Yeah, thank you for this. And, everybody here knows my experience that I am also a former public defender. And I think oftentimes public defenders get to see the interaction of all of the different areas. It's sort of like the four corners, in that when you see a client come in, you see how all of the different agencies in our criminal justice system and somebody experiencing homelessness have to navigate through all of this. What I wanted to bring up to my board members or council members is this idea in one of your slides, Jason, that of how many times somebody gets arrested, like the recidivism part of this, right? Our public defender office affectionately calls these crimes homeless crimes because it really is what most people experiencing homelessness are the people impacted by the crimes listed in Jason's slide. But we in Salt Lake City Justice Court, and I think this is a charge to us as council members to look into this analysis, we in Salt Lake City Justice Court do jail arraignments. So somebody gets picked up for trespassing at an abandoned house, because that's where they can find shelter, and they go into the jail, and the prosecutor says, well, we'll give them 2 days and let them go, but they have to plead guilty to it. Right? So you plead guilty, you do your 2 days, you get out of jail. And you still don't have anywhere to go, but now you have a Class C misdemeanor on your record. So you go back to another place so you can find shelter, and you get picked up again for trespass, but you know that you're only going to spend 2 days in jail. Maybe that's okay, and then you come back out. It's a complete revolving door. I had a client, it was 75 arrests, and it was all just homeless crimes, right? And that is something I think that, to Jason's point and to what we have here, that we need to be looking at. We have the ability, I think, to work with the administration to say, how is our city justice court working, and what can we do to improve it? We have a new presiding judge, Judge Landau, who's incredibly excited about looking at it being a more therapeutic court, where we're funding and looking at and expanding the programs and the access to the programs. Also, as a public defender, we sort of had, unfortunately, this idea, and it runs within our criminal justice system, is that, somebody who's experiencing mental health issues, it's going to take them longer sitting in jail to get them resources. They'll just time out of a Class B misdemeanor. You can only be in jail for 180 days on a Class B misdemeanor. It will take us that long to get resources for somebody experiencing mental health issues. So, let's just plead them out, get them out, so they're not sitting in jail, and wait till they become a felon, and then they have to be in there. So, basically, right, because they're poor and they can't afford bail, and there's all these other system ideas there, but then at least we can get them access to mental health issues. And so creating and looking at these ideas and these recommendations that are coming out of Minneapolis of funding, and looking at how we fund a more therapeutic justice court so that we can be more preventative in the beginning and not just use our jails as these revolving doors, which inevitably creates even harder obstacles, as Jason mentioned, to get into housing or get a job or get a license or do any of any resources or access to those programs. So I appreciate this perspective a lot, as I've seen it a lot. And so thank you for bringing this to our attention. I think there's really something that we as a council can do to look into this particular area. So there wasn't a question, sorry, just a statement. I get really passionate about this, clearly. I know you do too.
Appreciate it, yeah.
Thank you, Councilmember Fowler. Councilmember Valdemoros.
Thank you. This is great, and that's a great idea, Amy. And so I think a lot of us everybody in this town that is doing work with homeless understand how difficult it is, and I think we're all on the same page of how trying to help the most vulnerable in our community. And I think that is a great idea, this new perspective that we can work on our justice system. To my biggest concern to what you've presented and what Amy's talking about is, it is the appearance that we can help only those that want to be helped, only those that agree to the help that or the resources that I provided. And what do we do with those that do not want to accept the help, that do not want to use the vast resources that we have put it all together? And so that's my question to you. How do we help those that maybe it's December and it's 18 degrees outside and they do not want to go to a shelter at all? I had one right outside, a homeless man last night, actually, right outside my shop. And I asked him, would you like me to help you and take you to the shelter? And he said, to the road corner? I'm like, yes. And he said, absolutely not. That's where I got addicted to drugs, and so I do not want to go there. I'm like, oh, but we have other resources. We have news centers that we can take you to that you will feel safer, and we can. And he said, no, that's okay. So those are the ones I worry the most, because it's going to get cold. How do we help those? Do you have any ideas on that?
That's a great question. And just to be upfront, a lot of the social service stuff isn't necessarily our lane. But to speak to some of those issues, just anecdotally, that a lot of what we've run into or what we've seen, especially in the news media, is that some people may be shelter resistant because of a lack of understanding of exactly what the shelter provides or maybe what the new homeless resource centers provide. There's a recent, I think it was a Tribune article that talked about a person that did not believe they could go to a homeless resource center because they had an outstanding warrant, or if there's a pending case. And there seems to be some miscommunication, some public education efforts that could really help understand exactly what the services are that are being provided, and what are the barriers to access those services. Because from my understanding is that there's been a really concerted effort to reduce the barriers for access to services. But again, anecdotally, with a lot of the impacted population, it doesn't seem like there's a consensus about exactly what that means within that community itself. So I think the public education piece is important. And also, too, I think that we're seeing some really good progress, especially with law enforcement. Salt Lake City Police Department actually gave us some feedback on Operation Rio Grande Report Endgame. They're doing social worker programming where they go out with social workers to address some of these underlying issues and seeing if they can help people that may be resource resistant, or maybe take a different approach to these issues. And so within that area, it seems like if there's a public education component within that population, that could be very beneficial to make sure that people are on the same page about what those services actually are and what would actually prevent you from accessing those resources and how you can get over those barriers.
We can, there's a lot. We have an ambassador program that is really great, and I found out a lot of the other groups that this person could have gone, or other friends of mine that I've helped in the past, but it's hard for me to not have a solution for them. I want to help. I think we all in this community want to help, and we don't want them to be outside in the cold, but they also don't want our help. And that's where I have a conflict, like a true conflict in my mind. How is it? What else can we be doing to help, to educate, to bring them into shelter and then in the pathway of housing? that is not against the law?
Yeah, it's a great, difficult question. And I guess from our perspective at the ACLUs, we've got to be mindful about how we actually push that issue. And I think law enforcement first approach is really difficult, even though sometimes it seems like law enforcement is kind of a Swiss Army knife that's supposed to solve a lot of these issues. And again, that's kind of those social service outreach isn't necessarily what we do at the ACLU, but we would caution against kind of this law enforcement approach, especially even with the shelter-resistant population. That has proved to be problematic and not the best way to connect resources.
Councilmember Fowler, then Councilmember Johnston.
Yeah, I just have a quick question for you, Jason. I don't know if your underlines in your presentation are links that I can download and then go to, because I'm interested in some of their pre-arrest diversion programs that Minneapolis was looking at. If you could either direct me to further information or maybe email me so that I can read about those, I think that would be interesting to see how their city took those steps to fund and create some diversion programs, and sort of the steps they took to get to there, because I know it's not just overnight you create a diversion program, right? But how they kind of went through that. Maybe we can learn something from a little bit more information with that.
I'd be happy to do that. I think there was a link. I guess you don't have the notes on my slides.
No, sorry.
Okay, so yeah, I'll give you that information.
Awesome, thank you.
Chris.
Councilmember Johnston.
I love what Councilmember Fowler's talked about, and I understand Councilmember Valdemoris's conundrum, I guess. One of the things that may help is talking from just a legal perspective, thinking through our laws in the way they interact with the homeless versus the way they interact with maybe a lot of other folks. They may be set up with certain assumptions about your long-term thinking would prohibit you from taking an action that's contrary to the law because you don't want that long-term consequence. But when your perspective is not long-term, when your perspective is short-term survival, that law has a different effect on you. It doesn't interact the same way. And that's, I think, perhaps where we're looking at, how do we look at our penal code and say, the way that we assume it works on everybody isn't true. It's not working that way on folks who are only worried about their immediate survival needs, and thinking through that a little bit, I think. But you're right, this is sort of, the law is not going to sort of save it. The law can stop being a barrier in some ways and be helpful along with everything else we may talk about today, I hope.
Sorry, one more thing to that point. I think we have to remember there's a lot of different communities that experience homelessness and a lot of different, so everybody has a different perspective, every person. And what I think Jason's pointing out, what I've seen is that just one arrest, I mean, for trying to find shelter, that very first time you get arrested and go into jail can change the trajectory of your life forever. And if all we're doing is creating a revolving door without solutions for that one person that was finding one night of shelter, then that pattern is going to continue, and the criminal justice system is a problem to that, and is helping continue that pattern instead of trying to help break that pattern, right? And so I think we have to realize there's lots of different communities and they are affected in lots of different ways. The criminal justice system, fortunately for me, doesn't affect me in the same way as it may affect other people. And whether that's because I know it well, whether that's because I argue a lot, and I don't know, right? But it's there. And I think we have, and what Jason has brought to our attention is that we have an ability, at least one little cog of this very complex, very integrated issue we can look at and take this deeper dive into the analysis. Look at Operation Rio Grande. How much did that actually change recidivism? I was a part of being the public defenders when we had mass arrests, just trying to make sure constitutional rights weren't completely broken. And how much did that affect recidivism for the people in the Bs and the As and the Cs and the infractions? They were arrested several more times afterwards, right? I don't know that it affected any sort of recidivism. We saw that people would say they went into treatment programs and walk away from it, because that wasn't the answer to doing that, in my personal opinion. But we have the ability now to look at some other cities, learn from other cities, and say, how can we as a council and as a city start to have our local justice reform so that we're actually creating pathways to help people and not just these roadblocks.
I think, too, to add on to that when we look at other cities, too, we got to be very mindful that a lot of these issues are really dynamic because a lot of the infrastructure in each city is vastly different. And so it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. So what may work here in Salt Lake City may not work a few miles away in another city. So it's just something to keep in mind that there's a lot of infrastructure. So if we're looking at kind of shopping around for different ideas from other cities, municipalities, we got to really see like what they have ready to go, what we have ready to go, and what we need to do to shore up those loose ends, if we have any.
Great. I don't see any other questions, so Mr. Groth, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Of course, thank you.
The next speakers will be from the Salt Lake Valley Coalition to End Homelessness. We'll have Jean Hill, who's the co-chair, and Rob Wesselman, who's also the co-chair. So and the time that we've allocated for this is 10 minutes for a presentation, then 15 minutes for Q&A. But if your presentation goes longer,
No, but I've got handouts.
we'll work with you.
Thank
So-
you. I said bring that, I don't know if you can see it. Great. So the first thing I want to say is I would recommend Councilwoman Valdemoros, if you want to come to our community engagement or crisis response core function groups, you may get some answers. And Councilwoman Fowler, if you want to come to our legal rights group, you'll see legal defenders, Judge Baxter, law enforcement, all working together on exactly those issues. So.
Okay, I'm going to start. My name is Rob Westman. I'm the executive director of NAMI Utah, and I'm also the co-chair for the Salt Lake Valley Coalition to End Homelessness. And I really want to start out by talking about why the coalition exists. And really what we were doing is we were looking at really what the community needed, what best practices around the country, and making use of the momentum we had from the collective impact group that was formed here in the county, as well as the Salt Lake Continuum of Care. And so what we did is we really combined those two. And we're passing out right now a kind of a brief, this is our little sketch of what our coalition looks like with the steering committee in the middle and the core function groups around the outside. Really what this does is this allows anyone in the community who has an interest in this issue to find the right place to be the most effective in becoming involved and really setting the tone for making positive change, I think. So take a look at that. We'll talk a little bit more about this.
For those listening who are not familiar with NAMI, can you tell us what NAMI stands for?
Yeah, NAMI is the National Alliance on Mental Illness.
Thank you.
Very good. And I don't know where to begin with this, but so basically what we have tried to do is make sure that we are taking a county-wide look at homelessness rather than having individual agencies sort of all fighting for the same dollars and the same policies. We really want to be able to say, here's what's happening across the county in terms of what's going on with people who are experiencing homelessness. We want to give people who are having that experience or have had that experience a really meaningful voice in this process of figuring out what the gaps in services are and where we can best prioritize funding and policies to make the most impact on folks and to make homelessness brief, rare, and non-recurring, which is sort of the mantra for all of us, is to end homelessness in the county. To do that, we have created those core function groups. Each of those groups is focused on their core function, and right now most of those groups are engaged in deep data dives, trying to figure out what data we have, what data we need, so that we can better figure out what are the gaps in services. We all hear the anecdotes. There's a lot of truth in anecdotes. There's also a lot of misinformation in anecdotes. And so we're trying to sort of clear away that chaff and figure out what is actually happening on the ground. In the meantime, as we are transitioning to these resource centers, we are seeing the wrinkles coming up that we knew were going to happen in transition. We need to get through this transition period, and we need to do that. We are still very much, everyone involved is very much committed to the idea that no one goes without shelter. So there are options on the table that are being worked through to figure out how we make sure that no one is left on the streets. Yes. Okay. And as we're going through this transition process, there are a lot of folks coming to the table to really make sure we are not leaving those who are most vulnerable suffering through our transition. So that is happening. What you've got before you, as well as this snapshot report, that gives you just a sense of what each of those core function groups are focused on right now, where their core competencies are, and what data they're looking at and looking for. Rob and I each are co-chairs of one of those core function groups, as are a number of other folks in this room. And then a number of folks in this room are also part of the coalition, like Andrew. And many of the faces you're seeing here are part of the work to make sure we are better addressing the situation across the county. So I will just give you one because of what you were talking about with the ACLU, who is part of our legal rights group as well. Our group, one of the things we are focused on is making sure that those coming out of jail do have better access to services so that they aren't just going from jail to homelessness. And so we are trying to work with the LDAs, with the judges, who will admit right now what we have is a system where someone coming out of jail has to self-identify themselves as homeless, and that's not the best way to provide services. So we want to make sure that if their legal defender can get that information and get them that help, that that's possible at the jail before they come out, so that we can resolve homelessness in that gap. And that's really what the processes are looking like for many of our core function groups.
One of the things that the group looks at as well is the coalition wants to be very cognizant of, and it's what we talked about just before, the criminalization of homelessness. It's not a best practice around the country. It doesn't result in long-term stability of individuals who are experiencing homelessness. And so one of the things that we want to do is propose alternatives to that. So when someone, and I love the slide about, what if we decided that law enforcement would be the ones to get you to the doctor or to some other services, we wouldn't really promote that. And I think it's exactly the same thing. We want to promote other alternatives, get people into resources quicker, and then the whole thing about mental illness with homelessness. There's a huge overrepresentation of people with serious mental illness and other disorders who are in the homeless population, and we need to do a better job of addressing those individuals as well. And that's really what the coalition is designed to do, is bring those conversations to light, bring those better alternatives to interventions to light, so that we can propose, like as Jean said, we want to really look at the data and say, okay, these are the individuals we're working with, here's what's going to work, here's what's worked around the country, and let's make sure that this new system, which we're really right in the middle of developing, is going to be an effective one to decrease long-term homelessness.
I think that's about it. It is a housing first model, but it is housing not at the expense of folks who need shelter from night to night. So,
Great. Thank you both. Questions? Councilmember Johnston.
I don't have a question, Mr. Chair. I just want to wholly support the coalition. It is new as of April this year. It has a lot of elements from previous organizations, Continuum of Care, the collective impact from the county. A lot of folks have been doing a lot of work for a long time, including affordable housing groups.
Yes.
A lot of other small groups have been doing this for a long time as well.
Absolutely.
So it's taken a lot of those existing folks who were working on this and just brought them under one umbrella. So if anybody is interested here or elsewhere, I would recommend strongly what Jean said about participating. All this is online. The meetings are all noticed in advance.
Yep.
The meetings for all these core groups are on different days, so you can go to as many as you'd like. But really make this a focal point to have best practices, a whole plan that's not siloed, that we can really point to and all participate in to get a good solution here.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Fowler? Oh, I thought you had something. Councilmember Valdemoros.
I'm sorry if I'm ignorant on this one, but I didn't see it here, but sorry. Like English as a second language, sorry. Sorry, guys, hold on. Will we be having, there you go, like the vice versa thing for you. Will we be having an update on the resource centers that have been opened so far and what the experience has been with that? Is it this group or is it later? Do you know? No?
I don't know if there's one
Okay.
particular group. I mean, I think you know,
There will be.
There will be. Okay,
Yeah, it's
great.
on the agenda.
Great. Sorry. Thanks.
okay. Well, thank you
Great.
very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for your work. The next, we'll hear from Mayor Biskupski's administration, Deputy Chief of Staff David Litvak, and then in the audience, available if we have questions, would be Kathy Bray from Volunteers of America, Amanda Christensen and Sue Atavalu from Volunteers, Catherine Fife from Salt Lake County, Director of Programs, Chief Brown, who I don't see, and Jessica Waters. So, okay, he's in the chamber.
Okay.
All right, Mr. Litvak. the time
Thank
is
you,
yours.
Mr. Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. So before I jump in a couple different parts, I do want to introduce Michelle Hoon, sitting to my left. Michelle is part of what the council funded this last year in the budget and the mayor's recommendations is a little bit of restructuring that we're doing internally with our homeless outreach and homeless programs. And Michelle is our homeless programs manager. So she manages a team of individuals specifically focused on working with individuals experiencing homelessness. And Michelle is going to help me with the campaign update. So I've been asked to do two different things. One, provide you an update on the transition plan, particularly the housing campaign that was announced 2 weeks ago, and then also talk in a little bit more detail about Salt Lake City's approach to working with individuals experiencing homelessness that are living on the streets and how we seek to address their needs as well as the broader community's needs as well. So I want to start with the housing campaign and just give a brief overview of what that campaign is and who we are focused on and how it relates to the transition, and then turn a few minutes to Michelle to give you an update on the actual numbers. So our housing campaign, and I say our because it really is community-led, we are taking a lead in terms of facilitating and coordinating the effort. We are focused on housing 67 individuals over the next 30 days, and we're about, again, 2 weeks in. The short-term focus with the housing campaign is to address some of the capacity issues at the current resource centers and the downtown shelter. So our immediate focus are individuals that are touching shelter, right, that we know are within our shelter system right now. And that is broken up into 3 different focus groups. One, and this kind of was tackled a little bit earlier in Councilmember Johnston's conversation about vouchers, is we know there are 27 individuals currently in shelter that are chronically homeless, use a lot of shelter services, and they have currently rental assistance through vouchers and case management. And the only thing they are missing is a unit. So that is one focus area, of those 27 individuals by name that are using shelter services that just need some assistance to identify units. The second focus group are what we are referring to, maybe not the best descriptor, but high utilizers currently of shelter services. That is identified by individuals who over the last several years have been in shelter 365 days or more. And we are focusing on, as best as we can, the top 20 of those individuals who are currently in shelter. And that could be the downtown shelter or the 2 new resource centers that are up and running. The goal with those 2 first groups of individuals who are experiencing homelessness is we know that when we have chronically homeless individuals accessing shelter services and they're long-term stayers, that if we are able to transition those individuals into housing, that we can utilize that bed for 5 to 6 other individuals through the course of a year. So we can serve more individuals when long-term users of shelter services are housed. So we know there will be both a short-term and a long-term impact on shelter capacity in addressing those 2 specific populations. The third focus group are oh my gosh, I'm so bad at doing math, and every time I'm in public, I get worse. We have the 27, then we have the 20, and then we have another 20 that we are talking about are low barrier individuals that typically resolve maybe in 45 days, 60 days. And we know that if we can provide some emergency housing assistance when they first touch shelter, that they will self-resolve quicker. So there's some immediate short-term impact in terms of freeing up beds. It may not have that long-term because these are individuals that don't spend a lot of time in the system. We don't want them to, right? But it does have some of that most short-term impact. Those are the 3 target populations, so to speak, in terms of individuals experiencing homelessness. This effort is being funded through state dollars, a little over $400,000 that is being utilized for things like rental assistance. So the top 20 utilizers I mentioned, they do not have vouchers. They do not have case managers. So state funding will be used for both of those, as well as landlord incentives. So as you saw 2 weeks ago, a big push to bring more landlords, more units into this conversation and provide services and rental opportunities to this population. And with that, because I know we're really short for time, I'm going to let Michelle provide you an update in terms of where we are on all of that.
Thank you, David, and thank you, council members, for hosting this today. We, just to speak a little bit more about the role of the city in this process. So the city convenes daily calls and weekly in-person meetings with a placement coordination group. That placement coordination group includes case management leads, housing locators from each of the homeless resource centers and the downtown shelter. It also includes city and county housing authorities, as well as some folks from the VA and VOA, as well as the Utah Highway Patrol. The City Housing Authority is the main point of contact for new landlords who are wanting to partner with us on this effort. The City Housing Authority has been able to identify 20 new landlords who have come in as a result of this campaign, and working with them, we've identified 91 units in the last few weeks. The number of people, the number of high utilizers who are currently in process, who have been referred into the program, into the high utilizer program, is 29. 6 of those are currently residing at the King Center, 12 at the Miller, and 1 at the Men's Resource Center. With the vouchers, with the clients who have vouchers currently in hand, 1 of those has been housed by the VA and 2 have been housed by the Road Home already. 17 are coming in from the Road Home, 4 are coming in from the Miller Center, and 4 are coming in from the King Center as well. We have got 4 people who are in the pipeline for the quick emergency assistance that David has talked about. And so 3 people total have been housed already, with about 36 who are currently in the pipeline and should be housed fairly quickly.
Great.
Mr. Chair, are there any questions about the housing campaign or transition process that we can answer before I jump into the next piece?
Councilmember Fowler is considering.
So many questions.
Okay, Councilmember Rogers.
And Mr. Litvak, maybe you can remind me, I vaguely remember the state ran a bill for a voucher program, and then we have a voucher program, right? The state hasn't been able to release their funds, is that correct? Because of certain...
I'm not recalling a specific legislation having to do with state vouchers.
I believe that one, it's in the similar category. I think that one related to the for the damages and things like that. The 2 programs that
Mitigation.
we were hoping, yes.
Yes, so you're talking about the mitigation fund.
That's the one.
So yes, so there separate from this effort, there are state dollars available to utilize as a landlord incentive around mitigation. However, one of the points of discussion on the current program is that in order for a landlord to access that funding, it requires actual legal action taken against the tenant, eviction, things like that. We are, with the state's support, we're piloting in this housing campaign a mitigation effort for landlords that won't have that strict of requirements. So we will be able to offer new landlords, as a part of this housing push, what the Housing Authority referred to as a security blanket, that if there is damage, that up to $2,000 is available to cover the damage that may be caused. Now, there will be accountability for it. There will be assurances that that damage was actually caused by a tenant and not covered up and then discovered later, things like that. So we have a little bit more flexibility within the housing campaign to offer that as an incentive for new landlords.
And then I guess my follow-up question for you is, I don't know if there's anyone who is as familiar in Salt Lake City with what's going on with the state and the county than you. And in looking at that, do you know of any other programs that Salt Lake City or the county or their state that's being redundant, that could be streamlined to help, facilitate this in a faster way?
Well, first of all, I appreciate that comment, as wrong as you are. There's lots of people in this room, actually. I don't know the answer to that question right offhand, but I'm a little biased because I sit on the steering committee of the Salt Lake Valley Coalition to End Homelessness. I think with that effort and with bringing the pieces together that Councilmember Johnston, we no longer have a separate group doing continuum of care and a separate group doing collective impact, that we have the making of a coalition that's going to identify where there is duplication, how that can be resolved, or maybe where sometimes in a system duplication can be good. So I think we have the makings of moving towards a system where we will be able to identify best use of resources across all government units, as well as private funding and with local nonprofit community. How's that for punting?
That was good.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, Councilmember Fowler and then Councilmember Voldemorris.
Oops, excuse me, David. Thank you so much. I'm an optimist like you.
Yes,
so
thank you.
everybody for this great effort. I mean, the numbers of the units that we've been able to find. It's awesome. But I should still go back to the practicality of certain things and what happens if our plan is slightly short.
Sure.
So the question is, individuals who are sleeping outside in below freezing weather are at significant life safety risk if they don't have adequate equipment. What is being done or will be done in relation to their safety in this cold winter months coming up?
So it's a great question, and I appreciate the opportunity to address it. So the housing campaign is one part of a broader effort, and I want to start by going back to the commitment that all the electeds, Mayor Biskupski, Mayor Wilson, Lieutenant Governor, Speaker Wilson, and President of the Senate Adams made 3 weeks ago, that our number one goal that we're striving to, that we will achieve, is that no one will go without a warm place to be during the winter months, right? So that is something that we are all committed to. That may not necessarily be one of the resource center beds. It may be an overflow and different strategies. So that is the number one goal that we are all committed to, that the housing campaign is designed to address, as well as other initiatives. So a couple of the other things that are a part of the overall plan to address needs for individuals experiencing homelessness during the winter months are we have the overflow shelter that's currently operating, so St. Vinny's. We utilize and will utilize more hotel and motel vouchers. And right now we are actually transitioning, in the process of transitioning St. Vinny's, which has been utilized as a overflow for women. We are transitioning that to be an overflow for men, which it has been traditionally, and utilizing the motel and hotel vouchers for women. Now, all of that is, particularly with motel, hotel vouchers, is really identifying that the right person is in the right place. So motel, hotel vouchers are best utilized for someone that's ready to go into housing. and we're just, make that next step be the housing, whereas someone who's more vulnerable, utilizing the resource center bed, utilizing the overflow shelter. Another idea, another part of the plan that is still being worked through and is being considered but has not been finalized is looking at the Wiegand Center as a 24-hour warming center, but an intake and assessment center for 24 hours. So right now, the coordinated entry process for individuals accessing the homeless services system, Utah Community Action is coordinating, facilitating that process. And right now we use the Wiegand Center during their operating hours to connect individuals to those right services. So we know every night at about 8:30 at night that we were going to identify empty beds within the resource centers. And so individuals, when those beds are identified, individuals are transported from the Wiegand Center or from St. Vinny's to the vacant beds. And so we want to be able to utilize that process 24 hours. Now, that is something that's still being worked out and is not been cemented, but we're hoping to move forward on that.
And that's awesome. Once again, I go back, for some reason, I keep thinking about this, like, we go back to those individuals will be able to utilize all these resources if they want to. It's voluntarily, right? But then, in District 4, we see a lot of encampments. My constituency is very worried about what happens to those if we close the road home, if we don't have enough room, or if they decide not to use the services.
So, I'll address this way, and I'll also address it in the presentation I have on encampments. We also rely very heavily on our Volunteers of America team and partners, as well as our Community Connection Center, to make sure that those individuals, for whatever reasons, whether it's choice or whether it's there's real or perceived barriers and obstacles to that individual accessing our services system, we also want to make sure that their very basic needs are met where they're at. Right? And as a District 4 resident, I know exactly what you're talking about. And so we rely very heavily on our outreach teams, not just to continue to engage individuals in connecting to services, but also making sure that their very basic needs are met, that they will be warm where they're at.
Okay, so Councilmember Fowler, before I come to you, I'm going to go to Councilmember Johnston, who wants to answer Councilmember Rogers' question. Yeah, you could, let's do it here.
Just so I should have disclosed this earlier, I do work for Volunteers of America, who David Litvak mentioned as a contractor for the city for some services, but I've recused myself in any votes on those contracts prior to this, and I will in the future as well. The question Councilman Rogers had was about the barrier relief funds, essentially. The state one is specific to folks who actually have an adjudication of some sort of eviction or a risk of that, but it's also about a certain type of voucher, a Section 8 voucher.
That's right.
Think about the city's funds as sort of the ability to wrap around that and do a lot more folks in different circumstances before and after that, so they can work in tandem together instead of duplicating it all.
Thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah,
I appreciate
thank
adding that.
Councilmember Fowler.
Okay, I think I'm ready. So I appreciate that Anna has brought this up a couple of times of people who, for whatever reason, seem resource resistant. And oftentimes, I think people, a friend of mine and I were talking about this the other day, I think oftentimes people get misidentified as having a substance abuse issue or a law enforcement issue or a mental health issue, when in reality, it could be none of those things other than I don't want to go to the shelter because it's a scary place, right? So I appreciate that question and that continual question. And while I appreciate your efforts with the VOA and your community outreach team, I am also wondering, we know, and I see at least 2, 3, 4 advocates who work on a daily basis with our people our communities that are unsheltered, our communities experiencing homelessness. I'm wondering, how are we inviting them to the conversation for their expertise in what they have been doing really with the community, and they're all sitting on the front row behind you, and David, I know who you know who they are, but I think there's a voice missing in the conversation a little bit of to kind of address Anna's question, right? And so I guess I would ask that we reach out to those people who really every day are making these connections with our friends that are experiencing homelessness and can make recommendations on how we actually help people so that they're not back. Because one of the things I was thinking about and why I'm trying to formulate all of these thoughts in my head is, great, I'm excited about a landlord incentive program. Is there going to be somebody there to ensure that the space is safe and that the landlord is doing what the landlord needs to do? Is there going to be somebody there that reminds a caseworker, a friend, a person to visit once in a while, right? Because when we take somebody out of their community and put them somewhere else because we think it's better for them, how are we also addressing that human connection that they've made in their own communities? And I think that's one of the things that seems to be missing for me in this conversation. And I hope that as we continue this conversation, we invite those people to the table to bring in their insight and create a space that we're actually kind of doing this in a holistic way. It's not just about providing the resource and then making somebody go there. It's about understanding what that somebody needs and providing it for them. Right? And so I think really, I guess there wasn't a question involved. It was more of this, my opinion, in that I think there's other voices that need to be heard here. And I appreciate that there's meetings and there's things that they can get involved in. I also appreciate that oftentimes people won't do things unless we ask them to and invite them to the table. It's not just about saying there's a table and you should show up. It's about saying, here's a seat at the table. Do you mind sitting here and talking with us? And I would encourage us as a city and as an administration and as we move forward to have those conversations so that we are addressing this holistically.
Mr. Chair, may I don't know if you saw my head nodding. I have a little bit of a dizziness right now. Could not agree more. And I want you to feel assured that we understand that, and that we can always do better. Absolutely, can always do better, but we seek out that voice. As I go through how we approach encampments, that the voice of individuals experiencing homelessness is an important part of what we're doing. On a very personal level, I seek that out myself. I want to understand from the role that I have as a policy advisor on homelessness that we're not missing something. And so the coalition seeks and invites that voice. Again, we can always do better, but I could not agree with you more. That is a critical part of how we engage with individuals and understand that I may want that person housed, and I may think I know what's better for them, and hey, you know what? It may be better for them, but that's not where they're at, right? And I can't impose my solution onto that individual. And I need to be able to work with that individual, and our system needs to be able to work with that individual for when they are ready, whatever that means or whatever that looks like.
And may I suggest, as you said, David, and I appreciate that a lot, is when you said, that voice, that person that's experiencing homelessness is an important voice. Is it not probably the most important voice?
Absolutely.
And it's also something that we heard from Jason earlier, that we forget to ask people how they are impacted by the criminal justice system, how they are impacted by this. And so I appreciate you seeking that out, and just ask all of us to continue doing that and finding the space to do that.
Absolutely. Thank you.
So a couple of questions that I've received. I know that we've all probably received them as well, and hopefully you can shed some light on an answer. But you talked about the warming shelter, or the warming center and the overflow shelter. If both of those places are full, and you don't have the ability to get hotel rooms, who ends up making the decision on what happens to those individuals?
Mr. Chair, that's a great question. I think, one, it's a community decision and it's a collective decision. And I think you had elected officials who are committed to engaging in that conversation on an ongoing basis and not waiting to see where we end up with the housing campaign, for example, to be prepared to make that decision. And I know that is something that we will definitely be engaging the city council in as those conversations occur as well.
Okay. Because that's something that we're going to have, whoever those decision makers are going to have to be very nimble and very quick.
Absolutely.
Because when I hear, that we need to involve, or that elected officials are going to be, coming together and making these changes or making these suggestions, I don't know if we're going to have that time. I mean, the thing is, if it is, as Anna was mentioning, 18 degrees out, and those two facilities are full, and we can't get folks into a hotel room, what are the options? I mean, so if it's the elected officials who are going to be making the decisions, how quick realistically can that happen?
I think pretty quick, because I think we're all committed, and I think we're prepared to have what we need to have in place so it doesn't come down to that night, right? That the options are available, the commitment to that goal of making sure that there's a warm space for everyone, we will make sure that those options
And
are there.
what would those options be?
Right now, the ones that I mentioned in response to Councilmember Valdemoros' question.
Okay. All right. Other questions? Yeah, Councilmember Valdemoros.
Yes, as we put these questions together. So, David, in this, is there an aspect of the overall plan and the more immediate winter plans that address the issue of public camping? Have we
That
discussed
is a great transition point, if I could be so bold to suggest one. Is it okay, Mr. Chair, if I use that as an opportunity to jump into our approach to encampments?
Please do.
Okay, and if I don't answer the question, please make sure that you do. So you asked me. So I have to give a little bit of a disclaimer. I am so anti-PowerPoint. And so if I totally blow this, just be soft, be gentle, okay? So, what? Yeah, I know, right? That's why I had to ask. So I want to say that when we're talking about encampments and working with individuals experiencing homelessness that are living on the streets, all the decision-making, everything that we're doing is guided by these values and principles. That public space is for everyone. And I'm going to come back to this idea of coexistence versus co-opting. Safety, both public safety, public health safety, that we want to help individuals access and connect to information and services. So you heard Mr. Groth talk about making sure that you're sharing information about what resources are available. That's an important guiding value and principle. And that we're making decisions at a very specific, identified issue. We're making those decisions with data, that we're talking to individuals, we're gathering the facts, and letting those inform our decisions. And so let me just go back real quickly to this idea of public space. So I think we have to acknowledge that individuals experiencing homelessness that are not accessing resource centers are a part of our community and will always be a part of our community, regardless of how 100% awesome the new resource centers are. And so one of the things that we are always in search of is this idea of coexistence. How do we live together, be in the same space together as a community? And one of the decision points, if I may, is when that space may be being co-opted. Okay, when not everyone feels like they can access public space. We get calls sometimes that says, there is a homeless individual in my pocket park next to my house. I don't want them there. And we say to that individual, they have the right to be there. And will we sometimes send out our social workers or VOA to engage? Absolutely. But that individual has the right to be in that park. So starting in July of 2018, we started what I think I've called this 5 or 6, 7 different things, but I'll call for the purposes of today our Internal Homeless Services Committee. This committee is made up of individuals from the city, so you can see the different departments involved from the city. And then we have partners from outside the city, Volunteers of America, Salt Lake County Health Department, Highway Patrol, and the Department of Workforce Services. This group, and I'll get into the process, meets on a regular basis to address very specific. So I want to go to the purpose of the committee. The purpose of the committee is to problem solve around specific situations in our community where the intersect of individuals experiencing homelessness and public spaces, residents, to problem solve that specific situation. So we as a committee do not discuss what are we going to do about encampments in city parks in general. We are going to problem solve around encampments at Liberty Park, at Fairmont Park. So we're focused on specific issues, specific identified issues from the community. This approach also, at times, allows us to add additional stakeholders or resources into the conversation. So I use as an example civil enforcement. So when we first started, probably one of our most difficult issues that we've ever dealt with had to do with the Mountain Courtyard Suites. Who remembers the name of the cafe that was there? I always forget. Cinegrill, thank you. Who said that? Russell. Of course it was Russell. Of course Russell knew. So the Cinegrill, right, where the Cinegrill was. We had complaints of encampments. We had complaints of illegal activity, drug activity. And when we dug into the issue, what we also found was that there were a lot of problems with that apartment building itself and individuals being in unsafe situations. So in order to problem solve, we had to bring civil enforcement into that conversation. So what are the tools and resources that this group, this committee utilizes? I mentioned data. So we're getting data from CitySource, from our constituent outreach, from city staff experiences, from our conversations, Councilmember Fowler, from our conversations with individuals experiencing homelessness. Our community action teams are a resource. Oftentimes, our community action teams are addressing issues before they even need to come to this Internal Homeless Services Committee. They address it at a very local level. They have stakeholders at a very local level. You all are all familiar with our community action teams. Outreach, outreach, outreach. So the smarter Litvak that's in this room, Deputy Mayor Litvak, was teasing me. I hope she's here yet. Yes, she is. Okay. Hopefully that earns me some points. You know, I'm still recovering from 12 years in the legislature. Deputy Mayor Litvak teased me about this. Outreach, outreach, outreach. I said it 3 times. I probably would have said it many more if I could fit it on the screen. That is key. Outreach is key. We have Volunteers of America. We have Community Connection Center. We utilize other One Voice Recovery. We're trying right now to build relationships with the Indian Walk-In Center because we know there's this a segment of our homeless community that are Native Americans. We want to make sure that they're connecting with culturally appropriate services. So we're building those relationships so the Urban Indian Walk-In Center can become a part of that outreach. Public safety, both fire and dealing with medical issues, as well as our law enforcement, our co-responder. Salt Lake County Health Department, both an incredibly valuable stakeholder and an incredibly valuable resource. Advantage Services. Advantage Services, as you know, has the clean team. They help us when we have bio waste on public property. They help us when what we have is an abandoned encampment, when there's just stuff there and we just need it to be picked up. We have a contract with Advantage Services that can go out and address those issues right away. And we have other resources that we utilize. How are we making decisions? I feel like I did. No. So there was a slide missing. See, I told you, bad at PowerPoint. I'm not sure how that slide got missed, but that's okay. So how are we making decisions? With this Internal Homeless Services Committee, it's collaborative and consensus-driven decisions. Okay, we're making these decisions together. And again, we're not talking about homelessness across the city or encampments across the city. We're talking about and problem solving for a very specific issue, okay? Very specific focus. We're comprehensive and humane in our approach. So outreach, again, is key and ongoing. We work with individuals experiencing homelessness to mitigate impact on the community. So at times, one of the issues that is raised is individuals in public spaces and lots of trash. And so we work with those individuals and we say, hey, can you just clean up? And you know what? They do, and they're a part of the solution. When it is decided, collectively as a group, to abate an encampment, individuals are provided at least 48-hour notification of a scheduled cleanup. So the individuals are aware, and again, we're engaging, and oftentimes that message is delivered by our outreach teams. We're engaging with them. And then they also have an opportunity, also gives them an opportunity to abate the camp themselves, right? Types of the questions or information that we are trying to get at as we address encampments, obviously the location, but also the size of the encampment, whether the encampment is abandoned or occupied. And I won't go through this list, but you can read it. Again, we're trying to make decisions based on information, based on data. We want to be informed, and we want to tailor that solution to the specific problem that we're addressing. And with that, I'll just say here are some of the action steps that we have. So again, engagement, resource referral, and information sharing, working with the individuals experiencing homelessness to mitigate the community impact. We had a great opportunity over the last several months to work very closely with Liberty Wells Community Council to empower that community council to be a part of the solution of what was happening around Liberty Park. The clean team, public safety outreach, and when necessary, abatement with Salt Lake County Health Department. And that is the information. And happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Great. Questions for Mr. Litvak?
I do have a quick question. When you guys do like the clean team or the abatement team, is there any, I know it seems strange, but are you gathering any sort of information about what was there? i.e. like if we are seeing needles in a certain community or in a certain area, if there is, I mean, there's a lot to be said for what is in somebody's trash, right? Don't go looking through mine, it's crazy, but, right? And so I'm wondering if we're gathering information as we're going through this process, because again, as you mentioned, this is part of that data-based informed decision-making, and if that is something that's happening.
Absolutely. One of the challenges that we face utilizing data, when we were talking about the restrooms that were placed on the corner of 4th South and 4th West, and there were concerns and wanting to relocate those restrooms, we looked at the data. We knew how they were being used. We knew how often they were being used. So we knew that if we were going to, it couldn't be a question of taking away, it had to be a question of relocating. So the data becomes really important when you talk about the needles. One Voice Recovery is a great resource when we are identifying needles and the need for cleanup, as is the county health department. But we have placed kiosks around, we have 4 syringe kiosks placed within Salt Lake City. Those were placed based on data and where, and we're always monitoring that to see if there are other locations where that needs to occur.
And then I guess I appreciate the community engagement part. And I'm wondering how would, I mean, I know how I get a hold of you, but how would a community council or community members, you know, we're certainly seeing and have seen in Fairmont Park and Sugar House Park, how would our community councils or our community members get in touch with you to kind of learn what your process is and how we can be part of the solution as well?
Well, for any community council that wishes, we will come out and talk about processes, and we've done that, and talk about City Source. And so we try and be present in the community so it's easy for community members to get a hold of us. And You all know that we had Sandra Hollins. Now Dylan Hayes has taken her position. So we want to make sure that we're there. But I also want to say that we don't want to be only complaint driven, right, or complaint based. So we also really rely on, again, these weekly meetings to understand what that process is and what's happening around the city. So we're having conversations about it.
Okay. Councilmember Valdemoros?
So 2 questions. One, going back to the encampments, what's going to happen to the encampments? So for what I understood is like you're looking at the encampments and kind of observing what's happening, if they're going, if it's growing, and then you would tackle that issue per.
Correct.
Okay. So you know in our district, and you live by the parks, and we both.
Councilmember Valdemoros, can you pull the microphone
Sorry,
a little
we
closer?
do live by the parks and by the library. And the growing encampment in the library on the east side, it's been growing more than it's been being diffused. And so what happens to those individuals? Or what happens to those encampments? How do we help those? Or how do I answer to my constituency, Anna, what's going on? It's scary to go to the library.
So that's
I cannot take my kids to the library.
That's a great question. It goes back to that idea of public space for everyone and that idea of coexistence versus co-opting. Part of why size of an encampment becomes a factor, or part of why how long an encampment has been in a particular location becomes a factor, is because that's when we start to see or to hear concerns about access for everyone. So sorry to sound like a broken record, we will continue to tackle it by outreaching and working. And of course, there's experts at this table and behind me, or to the left of me, kitty corner, that can talk a little bit more about what that outreach specifically looks like and how do you engage with someone where they're at, and what types of services and information you're providing while you're trying to connect them. And let's be really clear, someone can go and does go, and we talk about this on a weekly basis, directly from the streets into housing. They don't have to go into a resource center in order to access housing. So oftentimes VOA is looking for the individuals that have been prioritized for the housing. So we're always tackling that through outreach by working with individuals where there are. And here's where I want to be really clear with what I'm saying, because it doesn't come across great. And I probably shouldn't have said that, but we are always balancing, and Library Square is a good example. We are always balancing the needs of individuals experiencing homelessness that are living on the streets with the needs of the residents nearby or around those individuals. And sometimes our solution is to move the encampments elsewhere. And that's not ideal because outreach could lose track of that individual, right? So part of making sure that we don't lose track of individuals. But at the same time, it gives that particular neighborhood some relief. And it may only be temporary, but it is some immediate relief. And so we see that sometimes when individual encampments will go from Library Square to Topher Park and then back and forth. We know it's not an ideal solution. That's why we have to continue to engage with those individuals and to seek access to services. But we also have to continue to struggle to find what that coexistence looks like and how we live together as a community.
And then the second question is, you said you empowered the Liberty Wells Community Council. Can you just talk a little bit about that so I can tell my constituents at Central City Community Council, for example, that meet right there at the Public Safety Building and they have those questions?
Yeah, absolutely.
How they can be involved, or you can send me.
Yeah,
an
I mean,
email,
I think the best thing to do would actually be to put the chairs of the Central City Community Council in touch with the chairs of the Liberty Wells Community Council, because it really started, and we have amazing chairs of all our community council meetings, right? Of our community councils. But it really started from wanting to engage in the conversation, in the difficult conversation of what does that coexistence looks like? If I just kick someone out of this park, am I really resolving the issue? How do I become a part of the broader conversation?
Let's do that. Thank you.
You're welcome. How's that for 10 minutes?
That was. Hey, I have no complaints. So it was good information. Other questions for David or his team? Councilmember Rogers.
My question isn't, I'm sorry, it's not around kind of what you discussed. Mine was over in regards to what Mr. Wood discussed in regards to 4 issues for helping affordability. One was ADUs, which we've looked at and passed. Zoning issues, which is what I want to discuss. TODs and RDA zoning issues. Has the administration found any zoning issues that is prohibiting us from doing affordability?
Yes. Next question. Oh,
And if so, I mean, is that something that we're looking at?
I think actually with Councilmember Fowler and Councilmember Mendenhall, in the conversations about SROs and single resident occupancies, I think we did identify some zoning barriers. We have areas in the city that are strictly zoned single resident, areas. So I think that is probably the number one issue that we've identified. We know that there are cities across the country that have tried to tackle that. And in our conversations around SROs, I think there's a lot of interest in the administration and the council coming together to identify what those zoning barriers are and beginning to address them.
Great. All right. Well, thank you very much. We appreciate it.
I will forward you a complete copy of the PowerPoint with the
Great.
one missing
With the
slide.
one missing
And
slide.
thank you for being gentle. I appreciate it.
Okay, so we will now hear again from the Salt Lake Valley Coalition to End Homelessness. On this one, though, we're going to be focused on the crisis response. Michelle Flynn and Jennifer Campbell will join us at the table. And if each of you could introduce yourselves and which organization you're with, that would be helpful.
Michelle Flynn, I'm with The Road Home, and I serve on the Salt Lake Valley Coalition to End Homelessness Steering Committee and as co-chair for the Crisis Core Function Work Group. And I brought my name tag up. I was asked to do. There we go.
I'm Jen Campbell. I'm the Executive Director of South Valley Services. We primarily serve victims of and survivors of domestic and sexual assault. We have a shelter that's located in West Jordan, and then we have mobile advocates that we co-locate in libraries and city halls throughout Salt Lake County and provide supportive services. We appreciate the time here to address you. I'll start and talk a little bit about our Crisis Response Core Function Group. I really appreciate the comments that were said. As a service provider, what I have appreciated about the Salt Lake Valley Coalition to End Homelessness is I was attending meetings everywhere I could to figure out how to bring voices of those that I serve. I technically serve a subpopulation of homelessness, and it was hard for me navigating all of those different places. I really appreciated when we shifted the way we were responding to homelessness to provide a location where our voices could come together and look at the promises or the problems that we're facing and look at solutions that we could collectively come and bring together. We are in particular looking at the crisis response. Our purpose is better connecting clients with crisis response services with a focus on resource centers, shelters, food security, diversion and intake, outreach, first responders, and medical respite that will support their efforts to find safety, security, maintain stable housing, and to make homelessness rare, brief, and non-recurring. That's a huge purpose, so let me talk a little bit more about that. So essentially, we have 6 subgroups that we work with in this core function group. Those are, one of those is resource centers and shelters. Some of the things our subgroups are looking at is the need to invite other providers to the table, figuring out who's not accessing shelter and why, looking at turnaway rates and data and what that means. We have a food security subgroup that meets. We have a diversion intake group who one of the things they're looking at is including how many people are able to be diverted, look at the type of questions asked at intake, looking at more information that we need to be collecting and how to better serve. Another subgroup is outreach and first responders. They're looking at data that we're gathering both from the Homeless Management Information System, HIMIS, and also data that isn't part of that service. So an agency like mine, my data doesn't show up into that. And so how do we better understand the services that are happening? There's also another subgroup is medical respite, who is looking at all of the different subgroups and figuring out how we can work closely within those committees to ensure that processes are established that are age-friendly to those that are in need. Some of the deliverables, we also have another subgroup of transportation and focusing on the issues there. Some of the things that we are looking in this function group is shared definitions of services, integrating domestic violence information with homeless services information, improved data on unsheltered services, looking at enhanced information services to older populations, and then another is understanding the impact capacity and the lack of it will have on overall use in our homeless systems, which Michelle will talk a little bit more about how we're looking at capacity and as we're navigating these changes.
Thank you. And first, I just want to thank you as city council members for holding this information gathering session. This is an incredibly complex issue. And we do have this crisis that's facing us every day. And it's really important that you hear about all the long-term and strategic planning and structure that we have in place, so you know we're also looking at the planning down the line. So thank you for taking so much time today. I just wanted to add on briefly to what Jen said. We do have the emergency shelter and outreach and diversion components in our crisis core function group. So we are looking at capacity. We are looking at the number of people that are out unsheltered, the reach that we have with our outreach teams, whether or not those folks are getting into emergency settings or going right into housing. There's a lot of data gathering that's going to be really beneficial for us all to be looking at as a community going forward. The issue of shelter and resource center capacity falls in our subgroup as well. And we're looking a little bit further out than what we're facing right now. We're looking at how is the capacity fit within our structure of diverting people, keeping lengths of stay short, and moving people into housing. How does that emergency shelter system fit in there, not just for the new resource centers that have come online, but our domestic violence shelters, which are always full and end up referring people over to our family shelter, our youth shelter, which came online a few years ago from Volunteers of America, which is also always full and not enough room for the number of youth. So we're looking at it from this higher level of how all these things are working together and making sure that we have targeted strategies towards the different communities and populations that exist in the guests that we see. So with that, what our plan is to pull this information together and feed it up with the other core function groups to the Salt Lake Valley Coalition Steering Committee, and we will be producing a document in the spring or early summer that will be a tool that will be able to identify gaps and priorities in our system. It'll be something that we're doing to provide to elected officials, to provide to funders, so that we can use our resources as strategically as possible. And with that, I'll just wrap it up and we can be open for questions. Oh, I will say one more thing. I just want to give a shout out to David Litvak, who almost sounded like he was a direct service provider. And want him to know we have lots of job openings in our field when you're in need. So thank you.
Okay, questions? That was very concise. Thank you. So we thank you so much for your service and for doing what you do. And thank you for your willingness to be here today.
Sure, absolutely.
So, Councilmember Johnston.
Just for the council to reiterate, the task group, the crisis response task group, I gotta get the terms right, is probably the place that a lot of these discussions about the emergency resource centers, capacity, all those kind of things we're talking about will reside. But it's not necessarily set up to do all the day-to-day, week-to-week stuff right now. And so that stuff is happening right now from a group of the providers, funders, and other folks who are meeting on a daily basis almost to talk through right now the transition from the current Rio Grande building to the new buildings and the capacity issues, et cetera, transportation, all that. But that group is a temporary transition team, and that will go away. So this group is where it's going to reside long term. So it may feel a little confusing about why they're not necessarily doing it right now, but they will. Right now we're in that transition phase.
Right. Okay, thank you very much. Jonathan Hardy. Mr. Hardy is the Director of Housing and Community Development Division with the Department of Workforce Services. Thank you for joining us today. And the time is yours.
Thank you, council members. It's a pleasure to be here with you, and we appreciate all the good work the city's doing. I can echo what everybody else has said. Everybody's been in on this effort, working really hard. I was asked specifically to talk about the state strategic plan and unsheltered homelessness, but I am available to answer other questions if you have them. I want to give a brief history of kind of where the state arrived to this strategic plan. We had an audit conducted by the Legislative Audit, Performance Audit. It was released in December 2018, which subsequently led to legislation, House Bill 342, in the 2018 general session, or 2019 general session, let me say, time's flying by, that required the State Homeless Coordinating Committee, which we staff, to develop a strategic plan and to outline goals and objectives and measurable benchmarks for progress. And one of the key components of that legislation and what the state has ultimately adopted as the strategic plan is to align with local communities, their goals, their objectives, their priorities, their funding, and their gaps. So the State Homeless Coordinating Committee is really an entity that issues the funding that the state's appropriates for direct homeless services. And the idea behind the state strategic plan aligning with these locals is figuring out what's being funded currently, what are the gaps in the system. You know, we're highlighting a lot of interesting conversations around where gaps are, where the bottlenecks may be. This is exactly what we're looking for, local input in how the state makes its investments. So the state strategic plan, making homelessness rare, brief, and non-recurring, and these are all posted on our website, housing.utah.gov, is really around achieving those three goals. And any local community that can identify how they're going to implement efforts to achieve those goals, that's the idea behind the state supporting it. So in conjunction with that, that's kind of the history of what the strategic plan says. And a short summary is your plan becomes our plan. And I can say that about unsheltered homelessness as well, how we will help support that from a state perspective. We've been working hand in glove a lot with Salt Lake City over the last 2.5 years on unsheltered homelessness through a variety of responses. We actually helped in conjunction with David Litvak and the Salt Lake PD, a toolkit for other communities on how to address unsheltered homelessness in their communities. Salt Lake City is nice. They got a robust system. You have a place you can call, and you have people that understand the issue on the other end of the line, which is a key component for most communities. It's nice that Salt Lake City has something like that. But you also have a lot of coordination between social workers and law enforcement, because typically law enforcement is the touch point for a lot of unsheltered homelessness. And so we support all of those efforts. We've supported it through Operation Rio Grande. We would still support it. But the bottom line is we're here to help support local community efforts in pushing these issues forward and aligning the state's strategic investments in conjunction with those plans. So with that, I'm open to any questions, but that's pretty much how the state strategic plan ties into unsheltered homelessness. It's really a coordinated effort between the local communities. And when I say that, we are looking to the Salt Lake Valley Coalition to End Homelessness as the entity that feeds those recommendations up to the state for Salt Lake County in general. So that would be the entity that issues all these recommendations to the State Homeless Coordinating Committee.
Great, thank you. Questions for Mr. Hardy? Councilmember Valdemoros.
Thank you. How are you doing?
Good.
Good. So thank you so much for that. And it seems like you have an outreach plan for the rest of the county or even for the state, so to other communities that have neighbors that are experiencing homelessness. What has that response been? Like, have you had a lot of takers on, hey, we have a plan, please help us with this, these are the gaps that we have in our communities? Or has it been, well, Salt Lake City has most of the resources right now, we're looking into it?
I'd say shortly after Operation Rio Grande, we received many phone calls from communities that, I don't want to say unsheltered homelessness was never there, but all of a sudden, everybody started to notice unsheltered homelessness. And so we have presented to several cities and counties on this particular issue. This is our, there's no silver bullet in this document because it really is, here's the principles you should develop as a local community, but it's still up to the local community on how that gets resourced, whether they have somebody on staff, how they train their police department, getting connected with the service providers in those communities. Those are all recommendations and that we would make to any community. So when we've been invited, we have gone. I don't think we've had a lot of those calls like in the most recent past, but we have had several communities contact us.
Thank you. And that was one in our press release. That was kind of our call as well to the rest of the county. Please, we are at a crisis and we need your help. I think Salt Lake City, we do a lot and we do a little bit more. But that was our call to action to the rest of the communities. Please, in our county at least, please help us as well with, if your neighbors are experiencing homelessness. Please help them too. So thank you for that effort and for coming over and telling us what your role is in this. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hardy. We appreciate you being here, and I don't think there are any more questions. So,
okay, thank you.
Thanks. Next on our agenda is Salt Lake County Mayor Wilson's administration. Deputy Mayor Aaron Litvak is here. And then her presenters will be Catherine Fife, who's the Salt Lake County Director of Programs, Karen Crompton, Salt Lake County Health and Human Services Director, and Gary Edwards, Salt Lake County Health Department Executive Director.
Hello.
Hello. Ms. Litvak, I'll turn it over to you.
Right. Well, thank you very much for the invitation today. We appreciate it. It's nice to see you all. Glad I came early. I just want to open with, I think you've done introductions of everyone, but I'm going to outline who's going to address which issues based on the memo we received from staff regarding the issues. So I'm going to just do an overview of our presentation and our presenters. So Catherine Fife is with us. She's the Director of Programs and Partnerships. She's going to talk about the county's role in the Salt Lake Valley Coalition to End Homelessness, and then some of the other ways that the county contributes to the homelessness initiatives. Our Human Services Department Director, Karen Crompton, is going to discuss social services that we provide at the county that touch homelessness. It's not exclusive to homelessness work, but the work we do in behavioral health services and our youth services program, as well as our contract with the LDA and how that touches and intersects with this population. And then third, we have our Director of the Health Department, Gary Edwards, who's going to talk about the role that we have in public health, from everything to a health emergency, to ways that we intersect with this community, and then our role in the encampment cleanups and mitigation throughout the city and the county. And I'll go ahead and turn the time over to Catherine to kick things off.
Thank you. I've been attending these meetings as a person who's watched all of this happen, but never had the privilege of sitting here. I also really admire all the work that you all do to make our communities a better place for everyone. So thank you for this effort and inviting us here. I really feel lucky to be in the role that I am at Salt Lake County, and I'm here to just describe that role. We're strong partners in really a community-wide effort to address homelessness. And my role here has been fairly short, last couple of years, but it is inspiring to see the number of stakeholders, individuals, community members, political leaders who all care so much and engage in this conversation. So it is really a privilege, and you've heard a lot about the Salt Lake Valley Coalition to End Homelessness, and really Salt Lake County is a partner in making sure that that community response to homelessness happens, that we are together facilitating and having a place for those conversations to happen, that those conversations are recorded, that the public knows when those conversations are happening, and that they can refer to those conversations for historical purposes as well. And Amy, you said some comments earlier about making sure that all individuals have a place at the table, and that is a role of the coalition to continuously strive to make sure that we are proactively inviting the right people to the table. And I see it happening more and more, and it just has to continue. And with the commitment of all of us here, even if we have differing opinions of the strategies, we all have a clear and aligned commitment to helping provide resources for those in need. And as long as we can continue to focus on that and have what are sometimes difficult conversations, we'll get there. Might take a minute because this is complex, but we will. So Salt Lake County, we fulfill a role called the collaborative applicant in the steering committee of the coalition, which so many of them are here today, or I'm sure they're listening. If they're not here, they're so amazing. They have chosen Salt Lake County to serve in the collaborative applicant role, and we're the ones who administer all of the functions, basically staff the coalition. We also apply for federal funding on behalf of our community for upwards of $8 million to provide housing for those experiencing homelessness. We also look for partnerships to apply for additional funding to bring additional resources to serve those who are in need. We want to be a part of the solution, and we want to make sure that we have a place where everyone can do that. So the coalition has voted to approve Salt Lake County to do that. But there are so many people within Salt Lake County that are committed to this effort as well. We have on the coalition of the 300 members, 14 Salt Lake County employees who are individually members. So many more of them attend meetings. And then while me and my team, there's a team of 3 of us who every day work on these issues. We meet weekly with internal staff members of Salt Lake County to address where areas throughout Salt Lake County intersect with homelessness, to make sure that we're most effectively utilizing our resources and also working together with our partners to address homelessness. So there's a lot of different ways that Salt Lake County does that. Just want to say that internally, much like Salt Lake City, Salt Lake County meets on a regular basis. At least every other week, we've been meeting more often with the current situation that we've been facing in our community with this big, huge shift in unique, innovative, new ways to address homelessness. It's scary. Do we all know that it's going to work? No. But are we committed to doing things differently than we've done things in the past? Yes. Are we going to be nimble to adjust if these things don't work? Absolutely. And I have confidence that that will happen because there's so many smart and willing people who are coming forward and being a part of the solution. We've heard a lot about the transition, and Andrew spoke about the transition team that's been meeting on a temporary basis, and thanks to the state for facilitating that and bringing us together. Salt Lake County has served on that transition committee. I have myself served on the steering committee, so we meet weekly and we speak daily, sometimes more than once, to make sure that we're really understanding and deploying our resources in the best way possible. And we work really closely with our partners, especially closely with the state and the city. I consider my colleagues at the state and the city close friends because we hang out so much, talking about what we can do to further our collective efforts to address homelessness. And those, I feel like I'm representing 2 things, right? All of the really smart, well-resourced people at Salt Lake County, and also this collective community effort that is led by the steering committee of the Salt Lake Valley Coalition. I feel like I'm a little bit of a bridge. But we have lots of tentacles out there trying to be more efficient, bring everyone together, but most importantly, make sure that we have a place to do that. So anyway, I think that is, in a nutshell, Salt Lake County's role in the Salt Lake Valley Coalition to End Homelessness.
Okay. I'm Karen Crompton, Director of Human Services for Salt Lake County, and I'm pleased to have the opportunity to share with you some of the intersections of human services with this overall issue. I think some of our divisions are maybe obvious to you. You hear a lot about the health department's role, but actually every division within Human Services touches on the issue. In Aging Adult Services, we have a case manager who focuses on the senior homeless population. We are seeing not only an increase in seniors across the state of the nation, but it's also an increasing population facing homelessness. In some cases, because a person can no longer afford to stay in an assisted living facility or other circumstance, and they are sometimes literally dumped on the street almost. So that's been a very positive addition to have a case manager associated with our Aging and Adult Services. Our Youth Services Department division has a homeless youth walk-in program. It's at our our Youth Services Receiving Center. The program can provide 24-hour services to homeless youth. There's no ID required to access these services. We can provide overnight shelter. We provide food, laundry, and shower facilities, and also counseling. We are limited to how long we can retain a youth within a facility like this, but it is a positive place for them to show up and for us to try to connect them to other services. Our Youth Services also has a program called the Milestone Program, which is a transitional living program for homeless youth up to age 21. We receive referrals sometimes from Volunteers of America, DCFS for kids, young adults who are aging out of foster care and have nowhere else to go. We have 3 homes. 2 are in Sandy and 1 is in West Valley. The 2 Sandy homes accommodate 10 young men, where we provide on-site case management for them, job counseling, education assistance. We have a facility in West Valley for young women. We will be adding early next year 4 additional rooms for young people to stay in our Sandy site. We're forming some good partnerships. Utah Valley University is going to be providing some scholarships to these youth, and not just giving them the scholarship to UVU, but intense mentoring to be sure they succeed when they get there. It's been an incredible program, and hearing some of the stories of successful youth who have gone through the Milestone program and transitioned into successful jobs and lives, we would love to share some of those letters with you. They are inspiring. In behavioral health, we have a really big touch on the homeless population and criminal justice population, which sometimes are interlinked, unfortunately. Through behavioral health, we help provide support for permanent supportive housing. You may have seen the news articles about the Denver Street project that opened last week that will accommodate 22 individuals. And next July, First Step House will be opening an apartment complex just over on 5th East that'll house 75 people. That's a huge impact on this population that really is very much underserved in this area. I would also say it's not a direct homeless issue, but since 2017, we've more than doubled the capacity for residential treatment at places like Odyssey House and First Step House. In 2017, we were at about 170 residential treatment beds available. We're now approaching 500. And again, these are people who might otherwise have found themselves on the street being homeless. It doesn't serve as a homeless shelter, but it does alleviate some of the pressure on the system. Last year, with some assistance from the state with a one-time grant, we launched a sober living program, which helps people who are transitioning from a residential care or the CATS program at the jail to a program where they can receive a voucher for up to 6 months to help them while they're transitioning to find permanent housing. We are expected to spend close to $2 million this year on vouchers, and we will be serving close to, last year was 423. This year we're going to be close to 900 clients that we're able to serve. The average length of stay is around 4 months. So we're very excited about these programs that, again, take some of the pressure off the homeless resource centers and other sources that are out there. One other piece that's been helpful, it was a change. It was part of a Medicaid waiver that allows for Medicaid dollars to pay for social detox. It hasn't increased necessarily the capacity at our detox centers for VOA, but it frees up county, city dollars that would have to be spent on detox to be paid for by Medicaid and utilize those funds for other kinds of services that this population needs. with that, I'm going to hand it off to Gary Edwards, who I said obviously has a very visible role in this whole conversation. So.
Thank you, and council members, good evening. Thank you for the opportunity to visit with you this evening. David Litvak talked a lot about encampments and cleanups, and that's probably the most visible piece that the health department has in the issue around homelessness in the county. I just want to clarify that the health department does not do the cleanups. We coordinate cleanups, and we do that because of our responsibility in state law to make sure that sources of filth in a community are abated. We work with public property owners, private property owners to help accomplish that. That coordination means that we work with city departments. We work with the county jail. They often provide inmate labor. We work with state agencies to provide various services. UDOT has been a tremendous resource to us with heavy equipment through some of the more recent cleanups. And the landfill has been a valuable resource and helpful by waiving the fee for the waste that is collected through cleanups. And we're talking thousands of tons of waste that has been gathered over the past couple of years. Again, want to emphasize that during the cold winter months, during these cleanups, we do not remove tents, blankets, sleeping bags. Those things are left. We're concerned about public health, and individuals need to stay warm. Many of these individuals choose to not seek temporary assistance through the resource centers. And during these cold winter months, those things are not going to be collected. We determine the cleanup, which one is going to happen, as David described, by meeting together with a committee of individuals. We prioritize. David went through a list of priority to determine where we are going to be. And so that's how all of that comes to happen. I wanted to talk a little bit more about the role of the public health, perhaps a little bit behind the scenes with this population. They are residents of Salt Lake County, and we have a responsibility to promote and protect health for all residents in Salt Lake County. The recent hepatitis A outbreak that was 18 months in duration was centered in the homeless population. We're fortunate that that population isn't necessarily fortunate with this, but the entire population of Salt Lake County is fortunate that that outbreak remained isolated to the homeless and substance abusing population. These individuals, however, because of their lifestyle, because of illness, chronic illnesses that they have, are sometimes more susceptible to more serious complications of an illness like hepatitis A. For example, during this hepatitis A outbreak, there were many more individuals hospitalized than we would see in a hepatitis A outbreak in the general community. We worked very closely with that community. Our nurses were on the river, were at encampments, identifying individuals, trying to identify those who might be ill and help them to seek treatment, but more often identifying individuals who could benefit from receiving vaccination. This isn't something new that we've done with this population. Many years ago, when West Nile virus became a new disease, we had our staff along the river providing individuals with insect repellent. So we work with this population. Another current example is the syringe exchange programs that have been established. It's a public health effort. It's not necessarily a Salt Lake County public health initiative. The legislature granted opportunity for community organizations to provide syringe exchange programs. We, along with the city, have worked with those organizations to try and come up with the best model for Salt Lake City. We provide the resource of taking the syringes that are collected by those organizations and making sure that they are disposed of properly. David mentioned the 4 kiosks that are available, and those service providers bring syringes to our office to make sure that they are disposed of. My staff, who is involved in the cleanup, report, and we obviously weren't counting syringes prior or even now, but the report is syringes, while they're still found in cleanups, there are not as many as there used to be. And so progress is being made in that effort. And with that, we'd be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, questions for any of the folks at the table? Councilmember Fowler.
I want to just say that I appreciate something that Karen brought up, and I made this big note on my notebook that says transitioning populations. And as we have been having this discussion throughout the afternoon, and sort of I brought up earlier the various communities that find themselves experiencing homelessness for one reason or another, and they're not all the same just at all. But one of the things that you brought up, and sorry I had to leave at the end of your presentation, David, but I would hope that we can ask the administration to work with the mayor-elect on this, of what are some of the programs that we can support for those transitioning populations, so that we are taking sort of that preventative step before somebody finds themselves experiencing homelessness. I mean, you brought up, I wrote down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 communities that are sort of, we know, on the verge or potentially on the verge of their next paycheck, their next Social Security payment that doesn't come through on time, of becoming homeless. And that's our aging senior populations. One that I didn't even think about until you mentioned it, but our youth that are aging out of foster care, our communities that are transitioning out of the criminal justice system, particularly when they're coming out of prison. Jail is one thing, but when you're coming out of prison and trying to find a new footing, our communities that are trying to transition out of substance abuse disorders, and of course our vets, right? And those are just the 5 that you sort of mentioned that are all in this stage of transitioning into something else. And I appreciate the programs that you talked about, and I wonder if that there's some collaboration there as we, I certainly, and we in this sitting up here don't have the power to create programs, but we certainly have the power to fund them. And right, we have that power to say, where is this and what should we be doing there, right? And what policies can we look at where we're protecting aging populations from their last paycheck of getting out, which is why, in part, we approved the ADUs, right? Because that is an alternative for our aging populations. But I would encourage our admin to work as you continue this coalition, and we work together with the mayor-elect to see how we can support those, so we take that preventative step. So thank you very much for reminding me of those populations that maybe we sort of forget about, but really are one step away from experiencing something we don't want them to have to experience.
Other questions? Councilmember Johnston.
Thanks for coming today. Mr. Edwards, from the health department's perspective, you mentioned that personal belongings like bedding and things wouldn't be taken or confiscated or thrown away. Did I hear that correctly?
During the winter months.
During the winter months?
Yes.
Can you explain how that decision is made and who makes that decision, I guess, depending on, because it's multiple jurisdictions across the valley, how does that work?
Well, I guess I'll be bold enough to say the health department makes that decision. We coordinate the cleanup. We get the individuals together to do the cleanup, and so we provide instruction before each cleanup. Here's what our responsibility is today. This is what we're looking for. This is what we're not going to disturb.
Could I just add on to that? Gary talks about we coordinate a lot of things, but we have health department employees who are directly involved in the cleanups, as well as a number of county volunteers. Last year, Deputy Mayor Aaron Litvak had the opportunity to participate at a cleanup on the Jordan River, and a number of other county employees as well. And I think it was a very eye-opening experience to see firsthand some of the challenges that are facing, whether it's the social workers who are going out there ahead of time or the cleanup crews that are out there. And if you're ever interested in a cleanup, I'm sure we could connect you with one.
And if I could add to that as well, I think it's been probably highlighted by Mr. Litvak's presentation as well as Gary's, but there is a 48-hour posting before a cleanup occurs, and we coordinate really closely with service providers to try to reach out and provide people who are experiencing homelessness a different opportunity other than sleeping on the street. So I think from a humane perspective, in the winter months, we came to the decision to not remove these things because we don't want anyone to be in harm's way during the cold winter months. But we do coordinate and try to mitigate those issues ahead of time. It's not just we're not going to do anything about this cleanup. It's we're going to try to make every effort to try to redirect this individual into a program that can help them long term.
Councilmember Rogers.
Yes, my question is for Mr. Edwards. How do you treat private camps on private property compared to public property? Is there a process of doing that? How is that done?
We are notified often by private property owners of an encampment on their property seeking assistance. At that time, we let them know the responsibility is theirs. We can provide them with some various resources. Many times, I shouldn't say many times, sometimes the property owners do not know that there isn't an encampment on their property. It gets reported to us by perhaps someone who is out hiking and saw a situation. We then investigate it, determine the urgency, visit with the property owner, work out a strategy between both them and their responsibility for cleanup, us and our responsibility for notifying individuals, helping them find other resources before that cleanup is handled.
So basically, if it's a private property owner downtown or a residence and they've got an encampment on their property, and they call you, you're going to say, here are the resources for you in order to move the encampment along.
Yes, we will remind them it's their property. They have to be the ones responsible for that mitigation.
And if they decide not to leave, that's when the police are notified, correct?
Well, yeah, there would be perhaps steps prior to the police being involved. We will try to work with that property owner to get that taken care of before we have to do anything, even civilly. But just through more encouragement. We typically, it doesn't have to be done right now. We work out a schedule with them to do the cleanup and make sure that it gets taken care of.
My question, this is just because along the Jordan River, there is a lot of that does go on people's backyards. And people have said, we've invited them to leave and they just keep on coming back. So
Right.
This is, if we could get that information that way, we could hand it out and just say, this is basically the protocol, these are the steps, and here's the information.
But to be clear, if there is an encampment on private property, the private property owner is responsible for the...
Private property owner is responsible,
pay,
yes.
Correct?
Yes.
But we can support them and help them in figuring out how to mitigate the situation and work through it.
Okay.
But it is a private property owner's decision whether or not to force out or evict essentially from that property, or?
It's their responsibility to clean the property. We would with social service providers, sometimes with law enforcement, be the ones going and visiting with the individuals that were encamped there and encouraging them to move to another location.
But if the private property owner decides they don't want to clean up or move them off their property, what does the city or county have responsibility to do, I guess, in that situation?
Well, both the, if it's on city property, I'm sorry, not city property, if it's within the city limit, the city and the county, as with a recent property that was not necessarily an encampment, but one that was infested with a lot of filth. We can go in jointly and actually do the cleanup and bill the property owner for that.
Based on city code, civil enforcement issues?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Public health code.
Other questions? So a question for Deputy Mayor Litvak. You guys have, a very, very tough responsibility to provide all the social services related to homelessness, correct? That's what counties do, or are supposed to do. Do you feel that you have the resources that you need in order to accomplish your mission?
I would say, first, I'd throw a caveat there. I think it's not just the county's responsibility for social services. We also have a lot of nonprofit partners that are offered funding through both state, county, and local efforts. So we rely unequivocally on those partners, whether it's Volunteers of America, Catholic Community Services, to partner with us to do those. When it comes to the services we provide at the county related to the health department and our other agencies, I feel like we are adequately funded. And I think we've been graced with a council that pays great attention to the issues that are in front of us and that are prevalent in our community. We have overmatched our behavioral health requirement from the state and the federal funding for at least a decade, as long as I've been at the county. And when we have true needs arise and we raise those issues and we go to our council, we usually work very closely with them to find the resources we need. Some of the biggest things that have impacted the work we do lately is the Medicaid expansion. It's a huge improvement for our community overall, and it's allowed us to leverage our dollars in new and creative ways and work more strategically with partners to get people the care that they need. I know Operation Rio Grande was a little controversial, but what it enabled us to do in relation to what Karen spoke to when we talked about the residential treatment beds, to go from 170 residential treatment beds to 500 residential treatment beds in the course of a year and a half is a huge service and positive outcome for our community overall. So I would say, we can always use more funding. There's always more need out there. But I do believe we're adequately funded and very well heard when it comes to these issues that need to be addressed in our community.
Could I just add to that?
Yeah.
In the area of behavioral health, a lack of resources is not our major challenge right now. As Aaron mentioned, the targeted adult Medicaid expansion has picked up a lot of the expense we were incurring. Our challenge right now is workforce. There are not enough social workers, especially LCSWs or therapists, to staff things. We have 36 beds open at First Step House right now because we can't hire therapists. And we're trying to work with the university statewide to get more people into the pipeline. I know there will be legislation proposed to maybe address tuition forgiveness and some other things, but workforce is really the major limiting factor we have now in addressing behavioral health issues.
Great, thank you. Other questions? Well, thank you for your partnership.
Thank you.
And it's a very tough job, and thank you all for your willingness to do it.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Absolutely. Okay, so that brings us to the end of our information gathering, fact-finding session for the day. We will have public comment opportunities during our work session, or our formal meeting tonight at 7 o'clock. If you would like to record something via video, you can still do that in the hall, just down the hall. if you want to record your comments instead of waiting until 7 o'clock. With that, I will look to our executive director for a report.
I don't think I have anything. But
Don't have
whether-
anything? Okay. And I don't have a report from the chair. Vice chair, do you have anything? Okay. With that, then we will adjourn until 7 o'clock across the hall.
Salt Lake City is an up-and-coming arts and culture destination. And to add to it, a new public art project is being installed right here on McCarthy Plaza and is set to open in mid-October. Kat Nix with the Salt Lake City Arts Council has details on this week's episode of Capital City News. And our History Minute is about horror legend Vincent Price. Let's get started with our legislative update and look back.
At its September 24th meeting, the City Council, acting as the redevelopment agency, approved a $3.3 million loan for a new housing development at about 4th West and 3rd South. They received an update on proposals for the Utah Theater property and approved the final step toward disbursing $6.1 million for affordable housing projects in the city.